The man was lying on the bed. His arm was stretched out towards the monitor. He was asleep, and he was trying to recover from a hard night's sleep. Looking at the white computer monitor, he tried to remember playing in his room. Was it really like that? The Suzumiya Kaede who was thinking all this was Suzumiya Kaede. He was 21 years old. He sat down and started to look around. Suzumiya Kaede was in a clearing, amongst the trees, and had no way of remembering what kind of place he woke up in. Most likely the new popular game Mazored Online was to blame. It drove all gamers who had tried it a little crazy. In it, the hero fought with various mythical monsters and was himself endowed with not a little magical power. He just graduated from college, and he spent all his free time playing this game Mazored Online. He was intoxicated by this game. It captured his mind, and every available minute he devoted himself to the game. He discovered a world of swords, magic, and thrilling adventures where both deadly enemies and loyal friends were encountered. All this came after a hard life and inevitable death in South Korea. After hours of relentless game mode, Suzumiya Kaede felt light. Everything around him blended. Day and night merged into one. The sun was replaced by a burning monitor screen. But when Suzumiya Kaede woke up, he felt infinite lightness and a burst of energy. He was in the middle of the forest in his everyday clothes, but he was so lost from reality that he didn't realize if he was wearing his shirt for sure. Suzumiya Kaede had never seen the place he woke up in before. Remembering how long Suzumiya Kaede had been playing without a break, he decided to agree with himself and decided it was all a dream. He covered his eyes with reassurance and exhaled with ease. He began to walk through the forest and looked around. 4 nights without sleep was too much for his body, so his imagination sent him to this very real place to rest. His gait was so light. It was as if he was floating above the ground. His feet hardly crumpled the grass. Everything seemed unreal. Looking back, he decided that he should, when he woke up, apologize to his guild in-game for being away for so long. He was still happy. Nevertheless, the guy was frustrated. After all, this man was just an ordinary farmer and was only given 20 hours. It wasn't even a full day. Disappointment gripped him, for this was not enough time to do anything meaningful. To the side of our warrior came another guy who said, "I knew it. That's why there have been so few survivors in the last few days. You're getting everyone here." The man who approached him stood on the head of one of the warriors our guy had defeated and asked, "Is this your handiwork? And did you finish them all off?" Suzumiya Kaede made a sudden movement to the side and tried to let out a terrifying howl as well, and no matter how strange his behavior seemed, it worked. His sound carried throughout the forest. The wolves tucked their tails and rushed frightened away from the creature they did not understand and crazy for them. He stood looking deep into the forest, where the wolves he had frightened had just fled. It was unusual. He was a gamer to the core. Suzumiya Kaede pondered the fact that he was gaming so much that he was now dreaming of gaming creatures as well. A rather huge and imposing warrior stood before us, his face adorned with an evil smile. He said, "You don't know who I am? You seem to be new here." He then introduced himself as Reaper of Souls Stefan. Continuing to grin evilly, he said, "Hey kid, that's not the way things are done. You killed my toy, you have to answer for that." After these words, he suddenly attacked our warrior with a shout, "I take it you are already ready to face my sword and answer for your nefarious deeds." Was this the player status window? There were numbers on the screen signifying the hero's training level. This could only be it. The player status window. The guy still managed to draw his sword and deflect part of his new opponent's blow. However, the one turned out to be stronger, and our hero flew away from him for several dozen meters. He began to grunt in pain as he looked at his enemy and realized how strong he was. After all, with just one swing of his sword, he sent him into the air. Suzumiya Kaede scrutinized his indicators. 2 of the stats were at maximum pumping levels. HP, the level of his life force, was full, but one of the stats, the MP level of his magic power, was too high. His indicator was also at maximum levels, but the numbers were tens of times larger than the others. Such a level greatly surprised the sleeping man. The Reaper of Souls gloomily glared at him while praising our warrior, for he had managed to block several of his blows. He continued to advance furiously, realizing his advantage in this fight. Looking deeper and deeper into him, the warrior rejoiced, for his opponent was not so simple, just the kind of opponent he needed. Looking at our warrior, he noticed that he was still too young and handsome. He was looking for just such a rare toy as this young man. But Suzumiya Kaede realized that it was all just a dream, and nothing around him, neither wolves nor statuses, mattered exactly. He was completely relaxed and just wanted to chill out, and the screen was still blinking in front of him. It was a beautiful summer day. The sun was shining brightly and relaxing with its warmth. At the very bottom of the screen, Suzumiya Kazda noticed a text. He was very interested in it and leaned closer to read it more closely. Suzumiya Kazda's skills were analyzed. He had the status of a swordmaster. There was also a talent for magic and a talent for all kinds of martial arts, and also on the status screen he was labeled as a foreigner. Foreigner? Suzumiya Kazda asked himself. Cutting it open, our warrior was shocked. After all, he was able to defeat an opponent who was several times stronger and more experienced. However, what he saw afterward shocked him even more. The defeated opponent was run in by his comrades. An old man with a huge axe was complaining about a recently deceased warrior. After all, that madman had started doing his obscenities again during the battle. He looked around looking around. Watching everything that was happening was so realistic that he thought more about the fact that he had fallen into reality, not in the usual dream words on the window statuses how high position you occupied in the former world, made him question everything he sees and feels. Suddenly, a pack of wolves appeared right in front of him. This time there were a lot more of them, and ahead of the two smaller dogs he'd seen earlier eating their prey was the leader. He was much larger than the others, about 3 times as big. His paws were bigger than Suzumiya Kazda's hands, and his wide grin indicated that he could bite off a large portion of a human at a time. The wolf leader was coming straight at Suzumiya Kazda. He wasn't afraid of him at all, and his raised withers indicated that he was ready to attack. Suzumiya Kazda took a fighting stance, waiting for the animals to attack. The head of the wolf pack stopped in front of the man. His eyes glistened with anticipation of battle and eating fresh flesh. The wolf's muzzle lit up with a sly and satisfied smile. Suzumiya Kazda, standing opposite the predator, didn't look scared at all. He was smiling. He didn't think it was all a dream anymore, but he definitely suspected the wolves looked very realistic. Afraid of his own thoughts, he called the wolves doggies. Suzumiya Kazda made a hasty decision and rushed away from the wolves who wanted to attack him. Need to run away. Even in his dreams, he was being chased by scary things. He quickly turned around in the opposite direction from the predators and ran. He wasn't a great athlete and didn't have tremendous running skills in real life, but here, his speed increased several times over. He was running much faster, and the wolf couldn't catch up with him at the same speed. Their pursuit lasted for some time. The wolf, the huge pack leader, was covering the distance in one jump while Suzumiya Kazda was running at the speed of a car. Everything around from the speed whizzed by so fast that it was impossible to notice where a tree was standing and where there was nothing. Suzumiya Kazda looked back at the animal chasing him and realized that he was running at a tremendous speed. But how could he do that? Is it all thanks to the Inomirian skill? He's running much faster than usual. That would be fine, but the wolf pack was just as fast as, and he probably wouldn't be able to break away from them. The wolf was getting closer and closer to Suzumiya Kazda, who was running away from him with every jump he made. Suzumiya Kazda was already very tired. His eyes widened and his breathing became frequent. Despite the deplorability of the situation, Suzumiya Kazda noticed that these dogs, as he called them, or dogs, were green in color, and there was clearly something wrong with them. There was no time to think so. Suzumiya Kazda quickly climbed a tree and sat on a huge, thick branch. The wolves didn't know how to climb trees, so they stopped in a waiting stance under the tree trunk, watching for their prey to climb down. The head of the wolf pack stopped on the ground under the tree and watched his prey closely. The animal didn't look tired at all, despite having not just run a huge distance at a tremendous speed. Meanwhile, Suzumiya Kazda, sitting on a tree branch, was watching what was happening. Down below, he was happy that his jumping strength had also improved, because he was now much faster, and his agility was no comparison to what it was in real life. Suzumiya Kazda realized that he wouldn't be able to stay on the tree branch for a very long time. Therefore, he urgently needed to think of something. He needed to think of a way to escape from this forest in front of him. A status window appeared in front of him, and he began to study it even more carefully than before. He should have a more useful skill to get out of this situation. While the wolves were surrounding the tree trunk where Suzumiya Kazda was, hanging his leg off the branch, the young man was busy analyzing his abilities. The status window was downloading all the necessary data for Suzumiya Kazda, while the wolves took a fighting stance waiting for their prey. Suzumiya Kazda was interested in one of his skills. It allowed the user to use an assessment in an object within sight. What this meant was that with such a skill, he would be able to watch information about the creatures that were near him. Despite the description of this skill, it looked quite cool and necessary for him. Suddenly an insight came into Suzumiya Kazda's head. He realized that he could use this skill without direct contact. Turning away from the message on the status window, Suzumiya Kazda looked at the wolf that was below him. Since Suzumiya Kazda was quite a professional gamer, he knew what to do in a situation like this. He abruptly extended his palm towards the wolf that was his opponent and shouted the word score. A status window appeared next to the huge green wolf. It listed its rank, its maximum strength, and other skills it may or may not have possessed. The animal had full life and strength. The green wolf had a low intelligence but a fairly strong 32nd level battle skill. Naturally, Suzumiya Kazda didn't know yet what the ranks meant and how strong the F-rank monsters of this world were. In any case, right now he wouldn't want to fight this monster until he had studied everything thoroughly. Taking a more comfortable pose on the tree trunk, Suzumiya Kazda continued to further study his skills. He had a talent for magic that allowed him to learn magic much faster than normal people of this world. He also had a skill that enhanced his fire spells. One of the sign skills, called Swordmaster, had almost the same description as the magic talent skill. Since magic interested the guy very much, he wondered how he could use it. He didn't have any weapons here, so he didn't understand how it worked yet. Suzumiya Kazda looked over the status window, and at this time an idea came into his head. Standing in front of the status window and extending his hand to the screen, he shouted, "Inventory." The status window changed its usual appearance, breaking up into small windows. After that, he shouted the word "item," waiting for what was about to happen. Suzumiya Kazda was looking at the status window with huge crazy eyes that was going to bring him the desired item. While the icons were changing around him, Suzumiya Kazda was in tense anticipation. Looking around him, he stared hopefully at each changing picture. Something was bound to appear here. The status window divided into several parts, and Suzumiya Kazda watched, waiting for the inventory to appear. Suzumiya Kazda carefully looked at the part that separated from the status window. The maximum level was similar to his magic level, but in front of that was 0. This meant that his magic level was completely unexplored. According to the data on the detached status window, there were empty cells. After reading the name, Suzumiya Kazda was glad that he had an inventory. He was confident that he definitely had those capabilities. 1012 was his maximum amount of magic, or did it mean inventory capacity was unclear. But looking at the number 0, everything fell into place. He had nothing. His inventory was completely empty, as well as his accumulated magic status and inventory window were still in front of him. He was looking for some commands he didn't know about yet to activate his powers and items. It was already nightfall, and it was getting dark around him. Suzumiya Kazda decided not to stop and try out his powers. He looked at the wolf that was waiting for him below and decided that some sort of spell had to be cast to use magic. The young man watched and wondered what would save him in this case. Suzumiya Kazda stretched out his hand towards the waiting animal and began to say the words fire, fireball. He wanted to use fire magic and was coming up with more and more words with that meaning. The wolf leader looked at the man who was saying incomprehensible things with an outstretched hand and was perplexed by the situation. He was puzzled by the victim's behavior. In the same state was Suzumiya Kazda, who realized that he could not do anything. Realizing his hopelessness, Suzumiya Kazda leaned against a tree. His smile looked crazy. He wasn't able to use the spell. He thought about how it would be much better if the flame itself appeared from his hands, not paying attention. He lifted his palm up, above which appeared a small fireball that glowed brightly without burning his master. Seeing the light in front of his face, Suzumiya Kazda looked away without turning his head. He saw a ring of fire flying silently in front of his face. It surprised him a lot and even scared him a little, even though he had gotten what he wanted. Frightened, he lowered his hand and deflected away from the burning ring, and he instantly extinguished. The young man almost fell off the tree branch out of fright, but managed to hold on to the trunk. He stared intently at the vapor from the disappearing fire. Was the word fireball the spell he had been waiting for? Or perhaps... And then an insight came to him. His eyes both opened wide, and he realized that he needed to visualize the spell in order to use the magic. After he thought it over carefully, Suzumiya Kazda's face changed and became devilish. The shadow under his eyes and the sly smile were frightening, but he knew that he could definitely handle it now. Suzumiya Kazda assumed a comfortable position on the tree trunk and extended his arm towards the wolf. The animal that was still guarding him didn't suspect a thing, and Suzumiya Kazda just needed to try his assumptions on the use of magic. Holding onto the trunk of a tree, he squatted down and watched his hand carefully. The young man decided to present the fireball in his hand, slowly rising to his feet and still holding onto the table with his hand. He carefully watched the wolf who was waiting for the moment to attack him. But it was a different wolf, much bigger than the old one. At this time, the wolf raised his head and also carefully watched what was happening to his victim. He was interested in the strange behavior of this man. Even though Suzumiya Kazda was in a very dangerous situation, this had become an exciting adventure for him. The young man was looking at the status window, scrutinizing it. His mood lifted from the opportunities he had. He hadn't felt as wonderful as he did now in a long time. His happy face and huge eyes said that he was enjoying what was happening, and it would be foolish for him not to take advantage of such opportunities. Suzumiya Kazda decided that he had to visualize well how a fireball would form on his hand to make it appear. After Suzumiya Kazda visualized, and the fireball actually appeared, he had to shoot it at the green wolf with his palm. Since Suzumiya Kazda was quite an avid gamer, it wasn't difficult for him to change his position and fling the fireball away from his opponent. But games were nothing compared to what was happening to him now. After all, he was now doing what he was playing in real time, and he was doing it well. He was very surprised at this development. Since the wolf's intelligence was at a minimal level, he just watched what was happening. The animal watched as his victim's position changed, and the man threw something bright at him. He just stood and watched, mesmerized by the object that flew right at him. The fireball hit right into the side of the green wolf. The impact was so strong that the wolf recoiled with a loud squeak of pain and his fur began to burn. The flames from the fireball consumed the wolf very quickly, and now it was no longer just a huge predator. It was a burning animal that screamed its pain throughout the forest, and instead of fur, it had fire. The fire spread and consumed the animal, and instead of a living thing, there was only fire that began to consume all its life and strength. The animal was dying. Suzumiya Kazda climbed down from the tree and started to get closer, looking at what he had just created. Ahead in the clearing, a fire was burning in the clearing, with remnants from his opponent sticking out of the flames. An unpleasant odor of burning flesh and fur appeared. Suzumiya Kazda stood looking at the dead animal and couldn't believe that he had managed to defeat his opponent. The young man was surprised by the incident and couldn't take his eyes off the burning animal. The poor six-legged wolf was lying on the earth, leaving only ashes from himself. Suzumiya Kazda clenched his fingers into a fist with such force that it seemed like it was about to burst from the strain. Suzumiya Kazda was happy that he had succeeded. It was something supernatural to him. The man shouted throughout the forest about his victory and jumped with happiness. But suddenly something stopped his joy. Suzumiya Kazda heard some incomprehensible sound and stopped his joyful shouts and began to listen to it. Like a professional, he stretched his arm forward, opening the status window in front of him, which immediately appeared as if on command. On the status window appeared his values. His life level decreased, and his magic power level increased by 500 points. He realized that the sound he had just heard, it was the sound of raising the level, found his stats had improved, but he had room to grow. The level of fire magic was 1. Apparently it was because he had just used it. Suzumiya Kazda was still standing there looking at his skills and levels. He didn't seem to fully understand what had happened to him yet. That you made Suzumiya Kazda look back and look at the wolf he had just defeated. The fire continued to spread, and the grass around the dead animal was already burned. Suzumiya Kazda was afraid that the fire was spreading. It could consume him and all the living things around him. The tongues of flame had already reached Suzumiya Kazda and began to burn his feet and belongings. Water was urgently needed. Suzumiya Kazda quickly looked around him, trying to see where the river was. But all he saw around him was grass and trees. He realized he could use magic. But how? He had never done it before, and he had to think of something. It was a different kind of magic than the fire he'd used before. Remember everything he had just learned he needed to visualize water. He stretched his hand forward and imagined water pouring out of his palm. Like a fire hose, drops of water began to appear around his fingers. He put 2 palms in front of him, and a huge amount of water appeared from them. The water poured onto the fire like a waterfall. Suzumiya Kazda looked at what he had just created in front of him. After Suzumiya Kazda put out the fire that he had made himself, he heard the same sound as before. A new level was available. A new magic. It was water magic. Its performance depended on intelligence, and its effectiveness depended on its level. After using water magic, Suzumiya Kazda was very tired. He seemed his arms and legs no longer held him. He stood in a half-bent state in front of the dead wolf that had already extinguished. The feeling after using magic was very strange, as if something was coming out of his body. Even though his life force level was at maximum level, his magic power level was decreasing, but all the magic he produced was at a very low level. He had maximum status, but the magic left much to be desired. Kneeling down from exhaustion, he decided to check his inventory. Stretching his arm out in front of him, the status window started to appear as well. everything around and say different pixels like in a real computer game, and instead of trees, new symbols appeared. Two obscure items appeared in his inventory. One was a wolf, and the other was a plant. Suzumiya Kazda didn't know what it meant yet, but he was already happy that his inventory wasn't empty. Despite all his joy, he felt extremely tired after the battle he had spent, and using the two new skills he was sitting in a clearing around him. Not a soul, his shoulders all life were slumped down. But despite all this, his eyes were full of happiness. He lifted them up and looked up at the sky. It all looked like it was far from being a dream, and for some reason it made him very happy. Suzumiya Kazda sat and looked at the moon in the night sky. He thought back to what he had read earlier in his world, about one of the people caught in another book called Dry Up. He was getting a slight feeling that he too had fallen into another world, and when he spoke his assumptions out loud, in a strange way it brought him comfort. The young man still sat on the ground looking up at the night sky and reminisced. Suzumiya Kazda's parents had died 2 years ago in a car accident. He didn't have any relatives or best friends, and players in the game are leaving the game because it's becoming less and less popular. Maybe he got into this world because there's nothing holding him back on Earth anymore. Suzumiya Kazda leaned his hands heavily on his legs and thought about the fact that if he was in another world, he still didn't know how to find his way back home. There was nothing holding him back, but at the same time he was thinking about how he didn't want to be here for some reason. Looking at the moon, it was as if he was begging it for help. Suzumiya Kazda spoke all his thoughts out loud. If he can't go back, maybe he will get to live in this world and have fun. The young man believed that this world would not be boring and gloomy like his real world. While Suzumiya Kazda was sitting on the ground talking to himself, behind him, a terrifying sound came from behind him. It was a loud, intimidating sound that hit his back with its vibrations. Suzumiya Kazda abruptly jumped up from the ground and rushed towards the direction of the sound, this scream as if begging for help. Could there be someone else here besides him? When the trees stopped covering the path in front of the boy, he stopped abruptly, seeing a terrible picture before his eyes. A horse-drawn wagon stood in the field, and around it were men with spears surrounded by 6-legged wolves. Several wolves had already been defeated by these men, and their corpses were lying on the ground. The rest of the animals tried to attack and harm the men who were defending themselves and their belongings. One of the wolves opened its mouth with a terrifying cry and bared its sharp big fangs. Its tongue was long and wet, ready to take food. 2 men fiercely fought the 6-legged wolves. One of them had a sword with which he deflected blows and wounded the animals. The other fought with a spear. They were very tense and tried to win this unequal fight. Apparently the battle had been going on for quite some time, because one of the men missed the wolf's blow and was hit in the shoulder. There was a huge bite on his shoulder, from which blood flowed, and the predator, smelling the scent of fresh blood, stopped in front of its victim, ready to attack him at any second. Suzumiya Kazda looked at the battle, in which everything could turn differently and people could die. The man decided he had to help them no matter what. Suzumiya Kazda looked at the distance that was between him and the wagon. That distance was huge, and there was no way his weak magic could help them. But if he used fire magic, the wagon could catch fire. Meanwhile, the wolves did not retreat. Pressing the fighting men closer and closer to her, he was not nervous and came to move. But Suzumiya Kazda decided that if he did nothing, these people would die. The young man stood up from his seat, ready to strike again. He would be doing it for the first time, but better he would try than do nothing. Crouching down on one knee, he extended his palm to the ground. The man tensed and tried to visualize what he wanted to do. Suzumiya Kazda wanted to visualize something like a spearhead. The ground beneath his hands trembled and began to take on a different shape. The man was now doing it all by himself, what he had been doing on his computer earlier. The stone arrows became more and more distinct and sharp. The young man realized that this was the stone that would pierce the green wolf. And as what he envisioned Suzumiya Kazda appeared, he became very focused. It's not just mouse and keyboard control after all. And Suzumiya Kazda made a sharp movement towards his opponents. After he made a movement towards the wolves, there was the sound of a level increase. He began to possess earth magic. With all his might, Suzumiya Kazda tried to make quick and precise movements with his hands, so that the stone arrow would hit directly at the wolf that stood in front of him and tried to attack the humans. The stone arrow pierced through the wolf. It hit him right in the side, and the wolf, who didn't have time to jump back, began to fall down in sharp pain. Sounds began to appear around Suzumiya Kazda, which foreshadowed the increase in his level and inventory. Meanwhile, the wolf was dying. When the stone spear hit the wolf's body, it shattered into small stone pieces. The wolf at this time was falling to the ground in terrible pain from the attack. Despite the weakness of magic, Suzumiya Kazda was able to harm the enemy, so he watched as his victim fell. The fact that the spear fell into small pieces upset Suzumiya Kazda. Looking at it, the young man thought about why it broke. Could it be that it wasn't strong enough? After all, this was the first time he was using the earth magic power. His eyes widened wide, looking at what was happening around him. It turned out that the blow was strong but not fatal, and the wolf that had received such a cruel blow turned around towards his opponent. All the other wolves followed suit, and now 18 huge paws were coming towards Suzumiya Kazda, who wanted to help people in trouble. The animals didn't growl and growl angrily. They approached, slowly scaring their prey. Their huge paws stepped softly but firmly, showing the seriousness of their intentions. Their jaws were bare fangs ready to tear Suzumiya Kazda into small pieces. But all this didn't make Suzumiya Kazda in some huge terror, and he thought that in any case, he managed to buy some time for himself and everyone else. So he decided to run away. As the wolves were distracted by the new enemy, they didn't notice that the warriors they had fought before had started their attack. 2 men with spear and sword attacked the wolves from behind, cutting off their heads and killing them. Mesmerized, Suzumiya Kazda stood and watched the battle that ended in victory due to his participation. The young man was enthralled by the fast movements of the humans and stood staring at them with his eyes wide open. One of the wolves was apparently not going to give up. He bared his teeth even more and checked all his opponents with his gaze. Only he was the last survivor and he was unlikely to win, but he would try very hard. The 2 men who were attacking, talking amongst themselves, decided that they would attack the remaining wolf together. Both agreed to this decision and quickly moved forward. The man with the spear crouched down in preparation to strike, and the man with the sword took a huge leap to strike with his weapon from above. The wolf turned toward his attackers, wanting to prevent his own death. Everything happened so fast, literally in a split second, and the only surviving wolf was left without a head. With a strong blow of sword and spear, the head flew aside and both men lowered their weapons. In the wide glade lay a multitude of animal corpses. Many of them had their heads severed. The men who were fighting fell down tiredly on their implement, and in front of them stood Suzumiya Kazda, who was carefully watching the good outcome of the events due to his help. The men who were friends thanked Suzumiya Kazda for his help. He had saved them. They were very grateful to him. Suzumiya Kazda was still standing amazed by the quickness and precision of the men's movements. He opened his mouth wide even, not knowing what to say to them in response. The men decided that it was necessary to find out where this Suzumiya Kazda came from. Apparently he came from the forest. But he didn't look like the typical adventurers of their world. The man with the sword asked Suzumiya Kazda why he was in the forest. Suzumiya Kazda smiled and thought about what to answer, deciding that the truth was better, so he told everything as it was. When he woke up, he was already in the forest. The young man did not remember much and could not tell them why he was there. The man with the sword assumed that Suzumiya Kazda had been attacked by monsters. Although judging by his appearance he was fine and had no wounds, he turned to his friend, urging him to look at the young man. But it turned out that the man with the sword was not his friend at all. An elderly man appeared from the wagon. He asked Suzumiya Kazda if he was the one who had saved them and thanked him with all his sincerity. His small eyes and wide smile were very good-natured. A man of not large stature climbed out of the wagon and introduced himself. His name was Carrick. He was a merchant, and the wagon belonged to him. Suzumiya Kazda scratched the back of his head. He was pleased to meet him and gave his name while the men got up from the ground and took a break to scrutinize the scene of the battle. While the men cleaned up the bodies of the dead wolves and talked among themselves, the elderly merchant tried to find out more about the guy he saw for the first time. The merchant seemed very simple-minded. The fact that he questioned the name Suzumiya Kazda surprised him a lot, and the young man opened his eyes questioningly and looked at the man carefully. It turned out that the merchant had heard that the man had amnesia and thought he could be of assistance, asking Suzumiya Kazda if he had any money or anything he could use to prove his identity. But Suzumiya Kazda didn't really have anything with him. He woke up without any belongings. The man thought about it and assumed that he had lost his belongings somewhere in the woods, but without Suzumiya Kazda's identity card, he wouldn't be able to enter the city. The kind man held out money to Suzumiya Kazda and said that he could use it for the guild's deposit and registration fee. The elderly merchant carefully placed the bag of money into Suzumiya Kazda's palms. The young man felt uneasy, and he apologized for his uneasiness and thanked the man for his help. Suzumiya Kazda looked at his opened palms and saw a huge amount of shiny silver coins. He couldn't believe that they were being given away for nothing. Not expecting such kindness, Suzumiya Kazda asked again to clarify if they were definitely silver coins. The elderly merchant asked if he thought it was a small reward. But that wasn't what the young man was asking at all. He was just thinking about how he could give away such precious items. A voice was heard, announcing that the merchant had forgotten about the currency. Suzumiya Kazda and the elderly merchant turned towards the voice to look at whoever else was getting out of the cart. It was a beautiful girl. Wearing a lush dress and a hat on her head, she cautiously approached the young man. The girl looked small and innocent. The pretty girl with sparkling eyes introduced herself. Her name was Saleh. She worked as an administrator at the Ain Guild's branch. Her blonde hair was braided into a beautiful pigtail. She smiled sweetly and asked to be called simply by her first name, Sally. The girl turned to the elderly merchant and asked him to take Suzumiya Kazda with her. The young girl absolutely hated to leave him here alone. Korak-san was fine with that, but the young man was very surprised by such kind behavior. When the cleaning and preparations were finished, the wagon moved on its way. The wheels of the wagon creaked quietly as it spun on its axis. Inside the wagon sat Suzumiya Kazda, and across from him sat Sally. The girl, folding her hands neatly in her lap, decided to explain everything to him from the beginning. This wagon they were in was traveling along a forest road near the Aina Guild. Within the wagon itself were many crates and sacks, all of them filled to the top with food. Suzumiya Kazda listened attentively to everything the girl told him and tried to put together a complete picture in his head. The young man decided to summarize her story, solidifying all the information in his head. They were now near a forest south of the city of Yen. It was a large city that was surrounded by a forest, and to it or several roads. And monsters tend to appear near the forest. So Sally and Korak-san were advancing with their bodyguards. Also, Sally told him about the currency of this world. The coin with the lowest value is iron. Next come copper, silver, gold, and large gold coins. One iron coin is worth 1 plate. That's about 10 yen. When the girl explained the whole structure of the currency of their world, she decided that was enough for the moment and ended the conversation. From the sudden movement of the cart, an apple fell out of one of the crates. Since Suzumiya Kazda was very hungry, since he hadn't eaten anything since he came to this world, his eyes randomly turned towards the food. He thanked the girl for explaining the whole situation, but his attention was drawn to the food that was in the crates. There was quite a lot of stuff, but why was it all needed in this world if there was such a thing as inventory? The young man decided to go to the elderly merchant and ask why they didn't use a skill like inventory. The elderly merchant turned to his companion and smiled softly. The skill inventory can only be used by those who have a talent for magic. Time in inventory stops, so it would be really convenient for merchants. But mages who can use it are usually high-ranked adventurers or soldiers from the country, because of which they are expensive to hire. The merchant explained that it was for these reasons that they could only carry a certain amount of products. Inventory is usually only used when transporting especially important goods. Once the man finished his explanation, Suzumiya Kazda thanked him since he understood everything. But to himself, he thought to himself that he only had an inventory because he had the talent for magic skill. This conversation reminded him that he had the analyze skill, which can also hide my skills and other information displayed on the status screen. So the young man decided that he'd better hide his skills that looked rare, since he would stand out too much in the future. As he sat in the wagon, he tapped on the status screen and hid his skills for his own safety. The wagon approached the gates of Yen City and stopped. The gates of the city began to open, but Suzumiya Kazda and Sally decided to get out of the wagon, leaving their companions there. They looked around. The name of Yen City was carved on the stone gate. A guard was sitting at the gate of the city. The sun blazing over the city was putting him to sleep, and he yawned through his sleep. The guard asked to see his ID card as a girl, and a young man approached him. Suzumiya Kazda didn't know what to say to the guard's questions. He didn't have his ID with him. But the girl Sally helped him. She answered the guard, saying that Kazda didn't have his ID with him. The guard said that if Suzumiya Kazda didn't have an ID, then he needed 1 silver coin for collateral, and he would allow him to touch the pattern on the wall. Suzumiya Kazda saw the intricate pattern on the wall and stared at it. Suzumiya Kazda asked Sally what the pattern was. She replied that it was a magical tool that evaluated a person. Touching it, we don't allow it. She told him that they don't allow bandits to enter the city that way. Levi, however, began to rejoice in this situation. After all, another opportunity for a battle had opened up before him that he could end in his favor. After all, he knew that because of his abilities, he would get a lot more time out of defeating them than normal humans. The young man thanked the girl. She seemed like a very nice person to him. The girl smiled sweetly at him and went the other way. Meanwhile, Suzumiya Kazda put his palm to a strange sign on the wall at the entrance of the city. Letters appeared on the sign like a mirror. It showed his name, Suzumiya Kazda, and his age, 21 years old. He was a male human with second-level skills. He had no criminal record. The signs on the stone were strange, but a translation appeared in front of Suzumiya Kazda's eyes, and he realized what was written there. Suzumiya Kazda carefully looked at the inscriptions that appeared and asked the guard if it was good. At this time, his mind was thinking that he could read all of this, and most likely this ability he had because of the language of another world skill. This skill most likely translates everything he says and vice versa. After all, he can communicate with Sally, who is helping him, without any problems. The guard far inattentively looked at the inscriptions that appeared on the image and said that there was no problem. But suddenly the sentinel was caught by something in the inscription. The words that appeared after being touched by the guy alerted him. The guard jumped up sharply from his seat when he saw the last name. He apologized to the guy and for being rude to him. At the guard's shouting, Sally came running in. She didn't understand what was the matter. The guard immediately said that this man was of noble blood and asked her to look at the inscriptions. Everyone stood and scrutinized the inscriptions that appeared on the magic artifact. At this time, Suzumiya Kazda's mind was spinning with many thoughts. How could he be of noble blood? Is it really because he has a family name? Now that the guard mentioned it, he sharply recalled the elderly merchant's reaction to the pronunciation of his name. Suzumiya Kazda thought that they all only said their first names, but what if it was actually their full name, and only nobles could have a family name? The young man's analyze skill abruptly appeared while he was looking at the guard Three-Eye Sally. The analysis window appeared next to Alya. It was a girl in her 20s with low vitality but high intelligence. She didn't have any skills. A sign also appeared next to the guard. His name was Guida. He was a 28-year-old man with a health level of 98. He had martial arts skills. After carefully studying the inscriptions on the analyzed screen, Suzumiya Kazda came to the conclusion that they did not have last names as he suspected. Therefore, Suzumiya Kazda made a lightning-fast decision to hide his data once again. He touched the magic artifact again, wanting to withhold unnecessary information. Sally approached the frightened Suzumiya Kazda. The girl asked him to look at his status. There was absolutely no emotion on Suzumiya Kazda's face other than fright. The young man was tense because of what might happen next if he failed at changing the information on the artifact. The girl walked over to the panel and saw only Kazda's name. Everything else was unchanged. Only the last name had disappeared. Sally looked carefully and saw nothing, but the guard just now had definitely seen the young man's last name. Constantly straining his eyes, he couldn't figure out where the writing on the wall had gone. He apologized to the young man, saying that he was probably mistaken, and greeted him warmly. Suzumiya Kazda was smiling because he had hidden his surname by using the Analyze skill on his own. Suzumiya Kazda and Sally entered the city and walked down a wide street. Among other people, he should be careful when he gives his data unknown how it might turn out next time. The young men approached a not tall, beautiful building with wooden doors. It was a branch of the Adventurers, one of the branches that was located in the city of Ain. Next to the building was the carriage they had arrived in. The young men went inside, where there were a lot of different people, and not only. They passed by a strange-looking man. He was more like a mixture of an animal and a bird. He was wearing a battlesuit and looked intimidating. Sally was giving a tour to Suzumiya Kazda. Taking a seat at one of the registration tables, the girl once again thanked Suzumiya Kazda for his help while they were advancing towards the city. After all, it was thanks to his help that they were able to fight off the Green Wolves and reach the city safely. Sally suggested that Suzumiya Kazda registered as an adventurer. To his knowledge, when he registers as an adventurer, he receives a guild card that he can use instead of an ID card. This card will also allow him to take guild quests. The registration fee will cost 3 silver coins. The girl once again asked if Suzumiya Kazda wanted to register as an adventurer, and the young man decided to agree. Suzumiya Kazda placed 3 silver coins on the registration counter that the elderly merchant had given him before. He needs to earn money to live in this world. Therefore, this offer was very useful to him. The girl held out a box to him and asked him to touch it. This box had the same grade as the gate. Suzumiya Kazda was slightly scared because he remembered what happened at the gate when his last name appeared on the image, but held out his palm for a registration analysis. No sooner had Suzumiya Kazda touched that box than inscriptions appeared on it already with more detailed information than what was previously on the gate of the city. But his translation skill didn't work in time before the girl took the box. Sally at the front desk thanked Suzumiya Kazda for touching that box and quickly took it away to transfer the data and fill out the registration card. On the girl's small face, her eyes became huge. Her gaze fell on the box that had all the details of the man standing in front of her, and something in these inscriptions alerted her. Seeing the changed face of the girl, Suzumiya Kazda asked her something wrong and stretched out his hands to take the box and verify for himself what was written on it. But the girl hurriedly took the box and said that nothing happened. From this box, she took out a guild card, and holding it out to the new owner with a smile, she hurriedly explained to him all the aspects that this card provided. On the card was drawn the guild crest, 2 lions that held paper and swords, and on the back there was already personal information. Sally pointed out that it would be necessary to listen to her carefully, as she was about to say some very important information. Passing the card into the hands of Suzumiya Kazda, she told what was on each line of the card. It shows all the data and deeds that Suzumiya Kazda has done. It must be read from top to bottom. It says race, gender, and below that rank. The lowest rank is 6th, the highest would be 5th. The girl was very friendly and explained to him with a wide smile that rank advancement was determined based on completed quests and history of defeated monsters. Starting at rank 6 and above, he would need to take tests to get a rank increase, although there were some exceptions. The girl also warned that his rank could be lowered if he performs tasks that are more difficult than his rank, and this would not lead to an improvement in performance, but instead to a deterioration in his life position. Suzumiya Kazda shifted his gaze to the girl, while that one was saying that there was a criminal record on the 3rd line of the card, but the only word that could be there in that section is bandit. Suzumiya Kazda focused his attention on that because anyone who does something illegal, be it murder or theft, would be called a bandit. Life in the guild branch was booming with people coming and going, and Suzumiya Kazda still stood there listening attentively to the girl's words. On the 4th line of his map would be the history of completed quests. On the 5th line would be the history of defeated monsters. At the moment of completing a task, new success data would automatically appear on this map. The girl covered her eyes embarrassedly from his intense scrutiny. She said that if he killed a bandit, it would also appear in the history of defeated monsters. She also clarified that if he kills a bandit by accident or in a coordinated duel, then this killing would not be considered as a crime, but as a defeated monster. The fact that there were duels in this world pleased Kazd very much, and he clarified, why do they classify bandits as monsters and give the same privileges for them? The girl concludes her conversation, put a small hand with thin fingers to her chest. If anything, they will know if the guild card is forged, since it's impossible to falsify this card. Sally warned that if he tried to forge even one of the cards, he would be executed immediately, so she said to treat it with care, not to lose it, and not to forge it. From everything Suzumiya Kazda had heard, it was as if he had lost his mind. He liked it, and it made him crazy. It was as if he was still in the real world and was starting to play some very exciting game. The look on his face was a little crazy. It all sounded very scary, though. The girl and Suzumiya Kazda sat across from each other and finished their conversation. That was all her explanation about using the card, and if Suzumiya Kazda had any questions, he could ask them right now. But Suzumiya Kazda didn't have any questions. He understood everything perfectly. Standing up from his seat, the girl announced that Suzumiya Kazda was now a full-fledged adventurer and a member of the guild in Yen City. She really hoped that Suzumiya Kazda would always remember his duties as a guild member. The Sally girl smiled softly at him, tilting her head slightly to the side as if studying him. Suzumiya Kazda confirmed that he would remember all of his duties as a guild member and thanked her for her detailed explanation of his duties and help. The girl continued to sit in her seat while Suzumiya Kazda withdrew in the other direction. Sally gave him a friendly wave of her hand. Meanwhile, another girl who also worked in this branch appeared behind her. Her face was cruel, and the straight hair that slightly covered her round face also gave her a stern expression. She carefully looked at her colleague, studying her strange behavior towards this Suzumiya Kazda. Deciding to be a bit sarcastic, the girl said that she was very rarely called Sally by anyone. Sally, who has never had a man in her life, so she expects too much. Maybe she had finally found a good man. The expression on Steele's face abruptly changed to angry. This was completely none of her colleague's business, and she asked her abruptly to return to her work. Turning away from her interlocutor, she continued to sit at the counter while her colleague was merrily strumming away to the tune of cheerful music. But she turned out to be very happy. After all, she had most likely found the right person. The girl's face was, and her cheeks were flushed. The girl from Joy folded her fists and squinted her eyes. After all, as soon as she saw this Suzumiya Kazda, she felt that something in her had changed. Even back then in the clearing, after his help from the wolf attack. She felt as if he was born in another world, not here, and it affected her a lot. So she wanted to help him, and kept looking at him. When she looked at the box describing his characteristics, she was very surprised. She had never heard or seen anything like that before. Both talent for magic and talent for martial arts were on his list. They both looked at it so carefully and studied it. His face was her kind of face, and most importantly, he was listening very carefully to her boring explanation about the guild's rules of behavior. This was so unusual. No one had ever listened to her boring speeches so deeply before. Sitting with her eyes closed, she recalled all of his tiny features. Her intuition told her that this Suzumiya Kazuda was her destiny. She was in her dreams and memories while the other girls walked behind her and asked her questions about her work. But she didn't answer because she was completely immersed in the dream world. It was evening in the town of Yen, and on the street lamps on all the facades of the houses were lit up. In one of those houses, Suzumiya Kazuda had taken up residence. He was now resting in the inn that the soldier at the gate recommended. And his room was not bad at all for its price. Suzumiya Kazuda lay in the middle of the bed fully dressed and was in his thoughts while he rested. He was remembering everything that had happened to him today. The young man felt tired, but not physically, but mentally, because after he woke up, his world had been turned upside down. He thought back to the status screen. After all, he could control it just by thinking about it. Suzumiya Kazuda was interested in the grass that he had gotten from nowhere and what it was he didn't know. His expression changed. He was no longer the usual boy with a carefree expression who only sought to get his hands on fun. The full weight of responsibility for his future life had fallen on his face. He remembered that moment in the battle when he had helped the outsiders escape from the wolves. In that moment, he had no doubt in his mind that what he was doing was wrong. It was a decision he had made without thinking. Remembering the huge pack of green wolves that circled around him, and then around the people he had helped save, he realized that everything had gone well, but things could have turned out differently, and he could have died in this battle. Putting his hands under his head, Suzumiya Kazuda realized that he needed to be more careful and alert. In the future, his recklessness could lead him to irreparable consequences. And so already after remembering the battle, he remembered that there are bandits in this world and even have duels that both pleased and alarmed him. Suzumiya Kazuda wondered if he could survive in such a world. After all, this world is unknown to him and unknown what was waiting for him around the corner of the house. He spent the night thinking about his future and what had happened. Outside the window, the sun was already rising and warming up the morning. Suzumiya Kazuda walked out of the inn and reached out sweetly to the sunlight, stretching out and contemplating further actions. The young man heard a pleasant aroma and realized that he was hungry. After all, he hadn't eaten anything at all since he came into this world. It smelled pretty good, so he decided to walk towards the smell. Upon entering the large, spacious room, Suzumiya Kazuda opened the heavy wooden door and began to look around. He was greeted by a young girl waitress in a friendly manner. Suzumiya Kazuda's gaze fell on her huge, bulging breasts. He didn't even notice her face, only heard her welcoming voice. As soon as he looked up, he saw that there were so many cute waitresses in this establishment, and they were all elves. All of them were greeting him happily. Suzumiya Kazuda was the first customer of the day. Each of them was interested in what he would like to have for breakfast today. The cute girls with huge breasts and pointy ears turned all their attention to Suzumiya Kazuda. Not expecting to see all these charms in one place, the expression on the young man's face changed. It seemed like someone's mouth was about to drool. These elven maids were hot girls. Suzumiya Kazuda was slightly confused and began to stutter, but he realized that he had to answer something to avoid looking stupid. Yes, he would like to have breakfast and asked for a menu or something like that. All the girls showed him to the table in a friendly manner. They always had menus on the table and all the food was very tasty. Taking a seat at the table, Suzumiya Kazuda took the menu in his hands. He, still looking around at the girls, couldn't believe he was seeing elves. It was strange and unusual for him. Despite their beautiful appearance, they frightened him a little. But he was grateful for this strange world, because before, he could never believe that this would happen to him, and all his anxiety gradually dissipated. While the girl maid was serving drinks to the tables, Suzumiya Kazuda was looking at her long, slender legs and the lush skirt that slightly covered her buttocks. He decided that he was definitely going to enjoy this world and all its delights. When Kazuda decided to leave the cafe, the girls came to the doorstep and bid him farewell. All the girls were happy to see the young man. He thanked them for the delicious food and walked away. Walking down the street, Kazuda thought about what he needed to do now. The young man was warming up and decided to go to the guild to pick up a few quests and get started on them. If he wanted to explore the outskirts of the city, he needed to buy the right equipment. Though he could rest a few nights in an inn with the money he had, it wouldn't be enough for him for long anyway. Therefore, He couldn't sit still and needed to go make more money. The young man kept his way to the guild amongst the low buildings. All the buildings around were brick with evenly laid roofs. People walked around in long, dark cloaks. As he walked through the small streets, all the houses became the same to him, and he no longer realized where he was. Standing in the middle of one of the streets that was also paved with bricks, Suzumiya Kazda tiredly leaned on his feet. The young man was lost, and he understood that very well. He needed help. Looking around, he thought about the fact that he had somehow found himself in an abandoned neighborhood. These places seemed scary to him, and the people looked like they wanted to kill him. The streets got smaller and smaller, and it was dark around every corner. As he approached one of the doors, the young man decided that he would need to ask around for a way to get out of this place. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was really stressing him out, and he wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. After first knocking and then opening the door, the young man walked in and immediately signaled that he was here. Suzumiya Kazda apologized loudly and wanted to ask how he could get out of here. Standing in the open doors, the young man asked the invisible people about how he could get out of here. Behind the doors sat an angry man who, without any greeting, asked who had told Kazda about this place. Kazda was startled by such a harsh sound and looked behind the door. He saw the formidable man sitting there. He was the one who spoke the words in such a rough voice. The man's face was covered with hair. His hair and beard were disheveled, and the man himself was large but short in stature. The master folded his arms on his chest menacingly and squinted at Caius. He speculated as to who it might be. But Kazda did not tell anyone. He just wanted to know the direction of the man, interrupted him, and stepped out from behind the door. The man walked to the counter, allowing Kaz to look around. It was a gun store. Swords and swords hung on the walls. They were all completely different, large and small, narrow and wide. On the shelves were shields. The mannequins were wearing armor. All around, everything glittered and sparkled from the metallic surface. The man said menacingly that if Kazda wasn't interested in weapons, he needed to get out of here quickly. Looking at all the shields that hung along the walls, the young man marveled at their grandeur and power. They shimmered in the sun with all the colors of the rainbow. Kazda thought the man was unfriendly, but he was interested in the weapons, because it was one of the items in his plan. Kazda decided to favor the angry man, so he told him that he was thinking of buying a gun. The man stopped him abruptly and asked him what his budget was. Kazda knew how much money he had and expected that it would be enough for him to put on his clothes and buy weapons. He had 1,300 taels. But he planned to earn more today after visiting the guild. The formidable shopkeeper cut all of Kaz's dreams short. For that kind of money, he wouldn't even be able to buy himself a knife here. Judging from his movements, he had a talent for magic, said the shopkeeper. Not considering that talent, does he really have nothing else? The boy's eyes widened. How could this man realize about his talent for magic just by looking at the movement? It was astonishing. Whether because of his stupidity or out of a desire to please the man, Kazda told him that he had woken up in the forest and was without money, having completely lost his memory. But he had managed to get some money along the way, so he was ready to buy something. But the man didn't care about what had happened to him. He was only interested in his ability to buy weapons. Kazda looked at the man in surprise. Hadn't he asked what he had just told him about? But the gun store owner said that since you didn't die in the forest, everything that had happened to you there had only made you stronger. The man decides to tell why he keeps interrupting him. He looks at Kazda's body and thinks his weapons should be a one-handed sword and shield. And if Kazda wants him to make them, he will need to pay 10,000 coins for the sword and 5,000 for the shield. But on one condition, that Kazda tells no one about this place. After all, a shopkeeper doesn't sell his stuff to people who don't know how to use it. That was the only reason the shopkeeper hadn't thrown Kazda out the door yet. He thought he looked talented enough to become a swordsman in the future. These words of the man struck him to the core. He didn't understand how this man could see such profound things. Kazda turned to leave and took one last look at the man. The man looked very rough, but he was actually caring. It was a trait of the dwarf. Kazda thanked the man and said he would be sure to come back when he had enough money. The man had already turned away, so he wouldn't have to look at Kazda, and wished him luck. And most importantly, not to die. As the door slammed shut behind the boy, the man behind the counter exhaled in relief. He liked this Suzumiya Kazda at first sight, but immediately the doors opened. Kazda had completely forgotten to ask for directions to the guild. The man was very angry, but at the same time he explained and showed him where he needed to go. Kazda quickly reached the branch of the Adventurers Guild in the city of Ain. All the female employees of this branch were busy doing their own things. They were handing out documents and arranging them in the right order. Each of them said hello to the new member of the guild. Kazda approached the girls and called Sally over to her, and she almost dropped the documents from her hands out of joy. The girl was instantly next to the guy, and he asked her if he could take a couple assignments for the guild. The girl smiled welcomingly and said sure. The rest of her co-workers were all carefully watching what was happening with the young couple. They were all very happy for their co-worker that she was in love and had finally found the person of her liking. Sally asked to follow her so that she could explain how the assignments for the guild are issued. The young man was still as attentive as the first time, looking at the girl and following her. She said to take the assignment, he just needed to take one of the plaques off the board and bring it to her. Suzumiya Kazda and the girl walked up to a huge wall that had plaques hanging on it, divided by rank. Suzumiya Kazda didn't expect to see such a large-scale work and examined all the plaques for each level in the guild. Sally reminded him to only take the plaque that corresponded to his rank. He was currently at rank 6. Suzumiya Kazda stood, his huge eyes rolled out of his eye sockets, looking at the tasks that belonged to the 6th round. It was herb gathering. There were tasks for laborers, a loader, and right now those were the only tasks that matched his rank. And the people who were standing in the same room were looking at Sally intently. She was very enthusiastic standing next to this strange man. Suzumiya Kazda chose one of the plaques and decided that he would take the herb gathering today. Sally got excited and said it was a great choice. As they walked to the front desk, Sally explained to him that he would need to collect Zunan herb. This herb, once processed, can be used as medicine. That was the end of her explanation. She said that he could go to the task and bring as much as he found. Suzumiya Kazda was surprised to see how much he would be paid for the task and asked why it was so cheap since Sally had just told him how rare it was. Sally turned to the young man and said, "Most of the time it's a common herb, but it grows scattered and 90% of the grass around it will be poisonous, so it's difficult to harvest in large quantities. And the cost of the herb was determined by the fact that most people brought herbs that they found completely by accident. That's why the payment is so small, since it brings it quite a lot." Stood behind the reception desk. Without expressing any enthusiasm, he just shook his head affirmatively. Suddenly, Suzumiya Kazda remembered something. He remembered the herb that was in his inventory, the one he didn't know and didn't understand how he found it. Exactly. He needed to get into his inventory and show this herb to Sally, in case it was something he needed to collect. After opening his magic inventory, the herb began to gather from small pixels in a living way right on the young man's hand. Once the transformation occurred, Suzumiya Kazda held it out to the girl and asked by chance if this was the herb needed for the task. The girl rejoiced and said that yes, this was what he would need to gather. This herb grew in the forest where Suzumiya Kazda woke up. He thought that if he didn't go deep into the forest, there wouldn't be any monsters there. He once again thanked the girl for the explanation and decided that he knew where to find her and went to fulfill his task. As he approached the edge of the forest, there were a lot of trees growing up ahead. It seemed that he was in the very clearing where he had met the people. The young man wandered for a long time in search of the herbs he needed. It seemed that he was already tired. He stopped and tried to steady his feet with his hands. The young man walked around a huge amount of territory, but he still couldn't find the grass he needed. Now he understood what the girl's words meant about people bringing grass found by chance. There wasn't a single blade of grass around him that needed it. It seemed to Kaz that last time this whole clearing had been dotted with the grass he needed, but now the only thing he found was poisonous grass. His tired gaze was rising toward the sky. He realized that all his searching was pointless. If the poison of this poisonous herb was stronger, he would definitely take it for the future. There were few situations where it might come in handy, but this poisonous herb, the only thing it causes is stomach pain and diarrhea. With that effect, it can only wear people down, not kill them. The young man squatted down and looked at the herb from his arsenal. He had been thinking about this for a very long time, and now in this situation, he wouldn't be able to use his analyze skill. Then how would he find the right herb for him among all these plants? Suzumiya Kazda decided to cover his eyes and tensed up very hard. He tried to find a clue or a new magic skill in his subconscious. Maybe he has some kind of ability like radar in him to find the things he needs. Suddenly, the whole world around him changed, and Suzumiya Kazda partially stopped seeing the outlines of the objects that were around him. He seemed to be starting to get good at something. Maybe not as well as he should, but he was getting good at it. Suddenly, he heard some kind of sound, which in the former world meant that the search was over. Opening his eyes, Suzumiya Kazda looked in front of him. He saw in the air a pointer that indicated the direction of travel. Suzumiya Kazda carefully looked at the sign. It was pointing straight ahead and down. Something was clearly located there. He walked forward in the direction that the sign was pointing, and it was a miracle. He saw what he was looking for. It was Zunana grass. But why didn't it respond to anything? So after all, Suzumiya Kazda had the radar skill, and he could find the grass near him in a short time. The young man looked at the Zunan grass he found using radar, as if it was a blessing. The young man was very excited that he had discovered a new ability. He started looking around to make the most of the badges. They were already appearing everywhere, and were pointing him in the direction and location of the herb he needed. These signs were constantly pointing to the right place, so Suzumiya Kazda was able to find a lot of herbs in a short time. It had been a long time since the young man had been as enthusiastic as he was now. Everything that was happening seemed like a sweet fairy tale. All of his abilities were only helping him right now. After gathering all the herbs he could find, Suzumiya Kazda came to the guild branch. He laid out the collected herbs and completed his task. By doing so, he amazed all the girls who were watching him. The amount of Zunan grass he had brought back had never been as much as he had brought back in such a short time. The girl was examining the laid-out pile of grass in front of her. She asked, how could he have gathered so much? Had he mixed it all with poisonous grass? But no. Suzumiya Kazda used his evaluation skill on all the herbs and thinks it was all medicinal herbs that were needed. Suzumiya Kazda revealed that he followed all the requirements of his assignment when gathering the herb. All the herb was no more than 15 centimeters long. He was very happy about this, that when picking it, it was so. This grass must grow very fast, so size was an important condition of his assignment. The girl examined each blade of grass and gathered it into a box for him to analyze and collect. She was so impressed with his skillful gathering that she asked him to wait for a while she checked the collected grass. Her eyes grew larger and larger from the analysis she saw in the box. So far, all the herb had been brought in without error. The girl was very much surprised by the amount of grass she had collected, and so she had a great many questions. That all he brought was the right herb, but how was he able to gather 203 pieces of herb? And also she had a question about the evaluation skill he used. After asking about the evaluation skill, Suzumiya Kazda realized that he was very much screwed. Since when collecting his skills, he didn't have such a skill. He tried to rather get out of the difficult situation, so he started lying. He wasn't referring to his evaluation, but specifically his evaluation instinct. He actually had a good one. Right now, Suzumiya Kazda was trying to convince everyone present of that. But the girl was not satisfied with his answers. She, slamming the table loudly, approached Kazda, because she didn't believe him. She clearly heard him say that he used the skill evaluation. Suzumiya Kazda was frightened by such a push from the girl and asked her to calm down. The girl was still angry, trying to calm down her anger, and Suzumiya Kazda spread his arms apart, showing that he was giving up from her pressure. He really had the skill of evaluation. It was most likely that it just wasn't displayed on the status window. That was why he had gathered so much grass. Was it really too good? The girl's irritation seemed to be going over the edge. She angrily glared at him with her lips pressed together. The girl was doing her best not to start yelling at him, because she couldn't believe the deception that was just happening. Trying to calm down, the girl placed the bag in front of the guy and said that she was just lost in wonder. She had never heard of such a skill that didn't show up on the status window, but at the same time, she gave away all the money he had earned. Suzumiya Kazda, taking his proceeds, realized that it was very close to his failure and decided that it was necessary to be more careful with his words next time. Slowly walking away from the counter, he thanked the girl once more and apologized to her for making her nervous. She still hadn't recovered from her surprise and just waved him off. Sally was still thinking about that appraisal skill. It was very mysterious to her. Suzumiya Kazda decided to waste no time and headed towards the owner of the weapon shop. As he approached the building, he heard loud noises that meant the man was currently busy working. Smoke was billowing from the chimney of his house, and he was obviously forging some kind of weapon. Cautiously entering the house from the open doors, he immediately yelled out that he was here to buy a shield, and of course apologized for bothering the man. The owner of the gun shop paid no attention to him. He was very busy with his business, so Kazd had no choice but to carefully enter the room and see what the man was doing who didn't answer him. As silly as it looked, Suzumiya Kazda decided that it was easier to yell and draw attention to himself than to carefully wait for the man to be free of his business. So he put his hands to his mouth to increase the volume and shouted, "Excuse me!" In response, Suzumiya Kazda immediately received a scream that stunned him. The man yelled for the man to shut up and just go in. He told Kazda to wait for him to get free. Walking deeper into the room, which turned out to be a workshop, Suzumiya Kazda began to look around. In one corner, he found metal plaques with various inscriptions on them. They interested him, and he wished to go over to take a closer look at them. On each of the plaques, in addition to various text, there was a signature, Dovera. The young man thought that the man, the owner of the gun shop, was so named as indicated on these plaques. Suzumiya Kazda looked around carefully and tried to muffle the loud sound that came from the hammer hitting metal, but he didn't seem to be able to do so. The owner of the armory was very busy with his work. He seemed to be so engrossed that he didn't notice anything around him. The man was wearing huge leather gloves on his hands. In one of his hands, he held a huge hammer, and in his other hand, he held a metal plate with pliers to break it off. Apparently, he was making a new sword. Each clang of the hammer on the metal only strengthened it, making it stronger and sharper. The owner of the armory, after each blow of the hammer, checked if the steel was strong and if there were no cracks on it. In front of him stood a huge bowl of water, into which he put the hot weapon. The water hissed, vaporizing and cooling the sword, hardening the steel. Watching the man's work closely, Kazd was very interesting. His skill and passion for his work amazed the young man to the core. The man sat down on a stump and said that he had finally finished the thing. Suzumiya Kazda wrapped his gaze around him, waiting for a continuation and explanation. What on earth was he doing with this? But the man wasn't going to tell him anything, so he started asking. Did he have any money? After all, he was the one who came to this shop recently. Suzumiya Kazda quickly replied that he had enough for a shield and would be very useful to him when using magic. They were in a huge hot room, in the middle of which stood a furnace with a huge pile of coals lying nearby. Various tools for making weapons were lying everywhere. The man looked menacingly at young Suzumiya Kazda and asked him if he knew how to use his magic. Given that he had a talent for magic, he could become an excellent swordsman. But if he doesn't otherwise, his hands will be occupied by a staff and shield. Suzumiya Kazda started to justify himself. He really has a talent for magic, and since the man evoked confidence and wisdom, he decided to check with him. Should he really use a staff while working with magic? The owner of the armory calmly replied that he hadn't seen anyone without a staff yet. Of course, people with a talent for magic could use it without a staff, but in that case, it would be harder to focus on her actions. Even if he could work without the staff, it would be much slower than with it. Suzumiya Kazda remembered how he controlled his magic and realized that using his hands with the staff would be much more effective. Magic is powerful without the staff, but what good is it if he can't hit the enemy? A staff only speeds up magic and it is much more convenient to work with. The young man thought about the man's words because he was probably right. For some reason, Suzumiya Kazda thought that there was such a skill as speed magic, and with it he could hit his targets without a staff. He directly imagined scattering fireballs at his opponents with great speed. But if he had a staff, he would be even faster, which meant his work would be much more efficient than it was now. The young man didn't decide that he would definitely need to buy a staff later. He stood there with a pensive look. Either way, he would listen to the advice the man gave him. Standing back, the shopkeeper told him not to relax. He had seen so many talented people in his long life who were just careless and died from not taking it seriously. Hearing such gentle and encouraging words, Suzumiya Kazda smiled and thought that this person was actually very kind, despite looking like an old dryad. Finished talking about the staff, the man brought Kazda a shield. He would need one anyway, and so they began to try them on. The owner of the armory handed the shield he had chosen to Suzumiya Kazda and asked him to try it on. In the arms shop owner's gaze, he could see that he was not satisfied with the way the shield was in Suzumiya Kazda's hands. He began to think about what he could change about it. His serious expression said that he cared about more than just selling weapons, but he did care about the safety of the people he was selling them to. As he approached the young Kazda with various shields, the gun shop owner was constantly trying on and scrutinizing how the shield held up in his hands. First one, but it proved to be too heavy for Suzumiya Kazda, so the man gave him another one. And yes, this one was indeed better, but still the man did not stop and looked at Suzumiya Kazda very carefully, as if imagining the young man's movements with this shield. When some sort of plan matured in the man's mind, he walked over to his desk where the leather parts were laying and decided what he needed to do. It turned out that there was an entirely different shield lying next to the table. The owner of the armory thought that this particular one would be perfect for Kazd. Smiling, he looked at Suzumiya Kazda and asked how he liked this shield. The young man's joy could not be conveyed in words. It looked wonderful, fully polished, lightweight, and comfortable. Suzumiya Kazda slid his hand into the shield and tried it on. The shield sat on his hand just perfectly. Looking at the other side, Suzumiya Kazda realized that the shield had become like a part of his body. The owner of the armory was the best craftsman in the business. Inspecting his purchase and standing in front of the huge vat of water, something began to bother Suzumiya Kazda. Therefore, he gently approached the weapons master. Suzumiya Kazda looked straight ahead at the man and said that he wanted to ask him some questions about the gunsmith master's work. The man smiled. He thought the young man had a few requests for the future sword making. But it turned out that was not what Suzumiya Kazuda's questions consisted of. The young man was interested in the process of making the sword itself, and standing next to a huge furnace where steel is tempered, Suzumiya Kazuda asked to observe the work of a master gunsmith. The man looked at the young man meaningfully. This request surprised the man very much. He began scratching his beard with his huge gloves, and did not understand why Kazuda, who had just purchased a shield from him, needed this information. Why was he interested in the subject of weapon making? There was metal lying on huge red-hot rocks, pounded with a huge hammer and shaped into the shape of a sword, hardening and strengthening it. The young man decided to share his knowledge of weapon making with the master of the armory. After all, this man, despite his harshness, was very kind to him. Suzumiya Kazuda was constantly commenting on all the movements of the gunsmith. The man listened to him attentively and constantly asked him if he was doing the right thing, about how it should be heated and then cooled down quickly after striking it. The man echoed him and repeated all his movements after the words of the young man, so they both stood near a huge red-hot furnace and forged a sword. After another blow, the swordsmith dipped the steel into the water. The water sizzled, boiled, and vaporized due to the high temperature of the metal immersed in it. The coldness of the water strengthened the steel for the sword, keeping the shape the master forged. Taking the sword out of the water, the man looked at it. The gun shop owner thought that this sword was very fragile, and it was also oddly shaped while the water was dripping off it. But after touching the weapon, the armory master realized that the sword was not fragile at all and would not break from a single blow. It was something incredible. He was already liking the new method of making weapons. It had been a long time since he had felt such emotions after making a weapon. The man had not expected such an effect. The young man's words helped him create something new. It was a completely different way of making swords. He couldn't wait to try and create new weapons. Suzumiya Kazuda was also looking at what was happening. He didn't know what to say. But seeing the surprise on the man's face, he realized that it was not for nothing that he stayed and told what he knew about smelting swords. The young man was glad to bring such joy to the master of the armory. He had never seen such a broad smile on his face. Coming to his senses from the unexpected exodus, he realized that this sword was solid. The gun store owner shouted throughout the house. It was as if steam was coming out of his ears from joy. It was so amazing and wonderful. The steel was so shifty and hard. The man was wildly delighted that all the advice he had followed had yielded a very good result. Suzumiya Kazuda stood looking at the man in bewilderment. The weapon store owner was happy like a child when he realized how it worked. The distortions of the sword just like that could be eliminated depending on how he would soften the steel in the process. The man was still continuing to look at the sword he had just made according to Suzumiya Kazuda's instructions. Although something made him very uneasy about this sword, the man was afraid that the sword could easily break because it was too stiff. The owner of the armory began to examine the metal and touch it, testing its strength. After saying that, Suzumiya Kazuda gave him another idea on how to fix it. He said that it might be necessary to heat the metal at a lower temperature and cool it more slowly. Then perhaps the metal would become much softer. But unfortunately, Suzumiya Kazuda didn't know the exact heating temperature. The gun shop owner was very satisfied. He understood everything Suzumiya Kazuda had told him, but what amazed him more was how such a young man knew such information. Everything he said was very interesting, and he would like to know where he learned from it. The man's elevated mood meant only one thing, that he rather wanted to get started on creating a new sword. The man decided that he would now close his store and test all the theories that Suzumiya Kazuda had voiced to him. The owner of the armory asked him to come back in 2 days. Gently pushing Suzumiya Kazuda out the door of his shop, the man said that if he made a quality sword, he would give it to Kazuda for free. Entering the house and slamming the doors loudly in the young man's face, the man ran off to create the weapon. Suzumiya Kazuda wasn't at all offended by being kicked out the door. This store had such poor customer service, but it seems Suzumiya Kazuda was happy to see this man satisfied and with a wide smile on his face. The young man was pleased with himself. Now that one business was done with, he had more business to take care of. And he set off once again to explore the town and his magical power. The next day, Suzumiya Kazuda decided to go out into the town. There was a huge amount of people walking along the street this town. All people were busy doing their own things. The young man was very much interested in yesterday's discussion about the staff, so he decided to check out all the adventurers in this town. He certainly didn't really want to use the evaluation skill on them, but Kaz needed to gather as much information as possible to study. As he strolled through the streets of this city, he met all sorts of adventurers. Big and small, even girls were there. Some held a sword, and some walked around unarmed. Suzumiya Kazda looked around at everyone who looked like an adventurer. As for their statuses, the people here have it at best at the maximum 30th level. It was surprising that there was no big difference between magic and power mana, which was not uncommon even for girls. But Suzumiya Kazda didn't see anyone with magic talent. There was martial arts talent among the adventurers around. Some had swordsmanship skills, but the level was minimal first or second, and most of the mages only had the attribute present. In addition to looking around at the local people and assessing their skills, Suzumiya Kazda stopped by various stores. And the one thing that caught his eye was that they were selling magical meat here. It was green wolf bread. He didn't notice any specialized stores for soldiers or mages here. Everything was quiet enough. Stores with necessary items and food, and wagons that brought everything in and out of the city. Clothing in this world was special too. Strangely enough, if one was completely in mud, it could be easily cleaned with just water. It was very convenient, especially considering the use of the water magic skill. It was easier for the young man to wash himself. He really wanted to take a bath. That was one of the reasons he was bored with the old world, not having a bath in this one. The young man still went about his task and gathered the herbs he needed. While searching for the herb, he was constantly in his thoughts. He was thinking about the development of levels in this world. He was thinking about how much he missed the old world. While searching, he didn't notice that it was getting dark outside, and he started looking around. Suzumiya Kazda was very much focused on his thoughts while gathering the necessary Zunin grass, and didn't notice how tired he was a bit more than usual. Dropping his head and shoulders, he decided that he'd better go home. But then he was stopped by some strange sound. Suzumiya Kazda tensed his whole body and looked back. In the back of his mind, he guessed where that sound was coming from. Suzumiya Kazda was being attacked by a terrifying monster. It was a huge green wolf. If Suzumiya Kazda hadn't dodged in time, the wolf would have bitten his head off long ago. Apparently, while gathering grass, Suzumiya Kazda got carried away and went farther than usual. Suzumiya Kazda pulled out his shield. He watched the green wolf's movements. Since there was very little time left, he urgently needed to find a way to defend and win. Raising his shield to his face, thus protecting his important organs, Suzumiya Kazda decided that he would use fire magic the moment the wolf landed on the ground. And so a second before the wolf's paws landed, Suzumiya Kazda thrust his hand forward and loudly shouted, "Fireball!" A huge pillar of fire instantly erupted from his hand and flew straight at the wolf, knocking it to the ground. Suzumiya Kazda's wide-open eyes stared straight ahead in front of him. What he saw after defeating the wolf frightened him. Right behind the wolf that the young man had just defeated, his brothers were running, and they were clearly very angry that Suzumiya Kazda had killed their 6-year-old friend. Those two green wolves wanted to attack him. Their grins were ready to claw into the living flesh of Suzumiya Kazda and not leave a single piece of him. Suzumiya Kazda grabbed his shield and started to run away. The wolves were very close to their victim and slowed down. Apparently, Kazda had nowhere to run to. It was a trap. The wolves slowed down not because of the game, but because 2 more wolves were blocking the way from the other side. And now in the middle of a huge clearing, the young man was surrounded by wolves. 4 huge and hungry green wolves growled and threatened Suzumiya Kazda's life. Each of them bared their teeth and ready to attack at any moment. Suzumiya Kazda stood and constantly looked around, panic overtaking him. After all, the situation seemed hopeless. He was alone. The wolves decided to rush into the attack. Thanks to their huge paws and flexible bodies, they moved very quickly. The young man watched the movement of the wolves carefully. He calculated their every move and was ready to strike. Kazda realized the hopelessness of his situation, calmed down, and made a decision to fight. With one side of his body, he defended himself with his sword, and with his other hand, he threw fireballs in the direction of those wolves who tried to attack him. The wolves instantly caught fire and began howling in pain. There was now fire instead of fur on the wolves. Suzumiya Kazda made a sharp movement with his head. He still had 2 more opponents left in the form of wolves. On the other side, he heard a strange sound and realized that the sound meant an increase in magic level. Turning around towards the living wolves, the young man saw one of them bearing right towards him. He put out one hand with a shield and raised the other to cast a spell and shoot fire directly at the wolf coming at him. And then he realized that there was only one wolf running at him. Where did the other one go? Before Suzumiya Kazda could finish his thought, a second wolf jumped on top of him. The green wolf jumped from the branch of a huge tree, wanting to remain unnoticed. The young man had to let go of his hand with magic and raise his other hand to protect himself with a shield. But how could the wolf be in the tree? How could it get up and jump on Kaz from the top? Since there wasn't much time left, Suzumiya Kazda crouched down and put his shield above his head, and the wolf that moment fell right on top of Suzumiya Kazda. But thanks to the young man's good reaction, the wolf didn't have time to bite his head off and snapped its teeth right on the metal shield. Suzumiya Kazda held onto the ground as the wolf was quite heavy and Suzumiya Kazda could lose his balance. While one of the wolves was fighting with the shield wanting to reach Suzumiya Kazda, the second green wolf was already very close and was ready to attack from the front on an unprotected part of his body. The young man had seen all of the wolves' movements, and in this case he also had a plan. He wouldn't just let himself be broken. To use magic, he only needed to visualize it. So while he was defending himself with his shield against one wolf, his other hand touched the earth, and he decided to throw all his powers into thought and create the weapon he needed. The earth beneath his hands began to shake and move. It became like clay that allowed itself to do whatever the young man wanted. That's why the wolf didn't have time to reach him. The huge wolf was struck by the omnidirectional stone spear that Suzumiya Kazda had created with the power of thought to destroy his opponents. It wasn't just one spear, there were several of them. Like arrows piercing through their bodies, they chopped the wolves apart. Suzumiya Kazda watched as one of the wolves was thrown upwards, keeping its body intact. It was a strong enough blow that it threw the heavy wolf a great distance. The wolf fought to the last. He kept on his feet with all his strength and carefully looked at his opponent, who was able to do such a huge damage to him almost without moving. But the use of Suzumiya Kazda's magic was great enough, and the green wolf collapsed dead weight on the ground from his wounds. Seeing the last opponent fall senseless, Suzumiya Kazda tried to exhale and calm down. This was very inconsiderate of him. It was too close to death. After this sudden attack by the wolves, Suzumiya Kazda gathered all the herbs he could find and came to the guild branch. This time, he dumped an even larger amount of zonin herb on the table. The faces of everyone around them changed. They didn't expect to see such a huge amount of medicinal herb in one place. Sally covered her eyes, while her colleague just gaped with delight and admiration. This time, Suzumiya Kazda had brought 697 pieces of zanana herb. The girl simply had no words. She had learned to discard all common sense towards this Kazda. Sally put all the herb he had found into a special box for inspection. Just like last time, this herb was all the right herb. Suzumiya Kazda smiled sweetly and asked if her words were a compliment. For all this herb, Suzumiya Kazda had collected 20,910 taels. The girl, counting out his earnings, asked how long had he been collecting this herb. Had he collected it for only one day? He thanked the girl for this payment and confirmed, yes, he had been picking it for a whole day. Kazda was so focused on picking the herb that he didn't notice he had inventoried too deep and was attacked by a pack of green wolves. Hearing this, the girl's face changed dramatically. She was frightened. A pack of green wolves is a terrible thing. Sally asked the young man if he was all right, but Suzumiya Kazda stood in front of her completely calm. There were only 5 wolves in the forest, and he had killed them with magic. The young man didn't understand why the girl's face changed so drastically. The mention of using magic had struck the girl very hard. Her eyes glittered and became huge. Sally didn't understand what was the difference between him and the other adventurers. Adventurers' magic was ineffective against a group of monsters. But how did this young man manage to kill them? There was a question on Suzumiya Kazda's face. What do you mean ineffective? He fought against a pack of wolves just by dodging them, and as he used his shield in one hand to repel all the predator's blows, he used his other hand to strike them with magic. The girl's face took on a gray hue. She looked exactly the same now as she had the first time he had mentioned the skill evaluation and then tried to trick her. But she wasn't going to scold. Instead, she exhaled and said that this thing he was doing was completely difficult. He needed to focus and stay still for about 3 seconds to gather his magic. And if he was also using a shield to protect himself from them, he probably had a hard time focusing. Suzumiya Kazda lowered his head and thought. The owner of the weapon shop had said the same thing. Was it really true? But it seemed to him that he hadn't wasted so much time to repel the attack and defend himself. Sally looked at Suzumiya Kazda and was glad it was important for her to know that this man was really all right. If he needed a potion or healing spell, she could call a mage for this man. That everything was all right, he had nothing to worry about. And in his head about healing spells and potions. Thinking deeply, he realized that it was good to hear this information would definitely be about magic more. Walking out of the guild branch, he thought about the fact that in this world his mana regenerated at a rate of 1 position per minute. That was what was stated in the beginning. The young man's reserve of magic mana is over 2,000, so he is recovering his mana at a rate of more than 2 positions per minute. He would need a strong magic to help repel the attacks of several enemies at once. It would be foolish of him to continue using inexpensive spells, and perhaps he should still use healing spells to compensate for his lack of perception. Clenching his fist, the man told himself with confidence he firmly decided that he would develop his magic, by all means. Putting his folded fist to his chest, he assured himself that his goal to develop his magic, he would become a sword mage through all his skills and knowledge. Choosing a place for his training was not difficult. It was still the same forest and still the same clearing where his recent battles with the green wolves had taken place. As Suzumiya Kazda walked to his desired location, he decided that he would test his magic here. At the moment, due to his rank, he needed search-type magic to make up for the lack of knowledge about the area, as his knowledge was not enough for him. Standing amongst the trees with his arms outstretched, Suzumiya Kazda tried to figure out how he needed to proceed, what he needed to visualize when he was exploring the terrain. How was he to release magic outward? His movements and behavior was strange, and if you looked at him from the outside, and even animals avoided him, believing that this madman could bring harm. The shield he had purchased from the armorer's store. Suzumiya Kazda always carried it with him after he used search-type magic. He decided to test it and went deep into the forest. After finding a suitable place, Suzumiya Kazda stretched out his hand in a familiar motion. He needed to visualize the magical energy coming out of his palm. Standing right in front of the chosen tree, Suzumiya Kazda directed his energy straight towards it. Suzumiya Kazda needed his magic to reach that tree. After the invisible stream of energy approached the table, the trunk itself changed and began to crumble. The young man did not expect this outcome of events, that from the first time he could achieve a good enough effect when using magic. A few dozen meters away from the tree, he smiled with his hand not touching. Suzumiya Kazda could feel the bark of the tree, and it excited him. After he was able to use this on the nearest tree, Suzumiya Kazda realized how he needed to proceed further, and he decided to extend his range to a greater distance. After he increased the distance of his evaluation, Suzumiya Kazda began to sense all objects and living beings that were out of his range. Suzumiya Kazda sensed a small, fluffy rabbit far away from him, and a snake that crawled completely silently a stone on a rock or trees on the outskirts, as if the area was a new grass or an apple, or perhaps that bird that flies far up in the sky and doesn't see him. All this flood of emotions and sensations were carried as information into his head. It seems that the young man's brain can no longer handle it. It was not good at all. So many emotions Suzumiya Kazda can't handle at one time. After finishing this stream of information, Suzumiya Kazda collapsed on the ground. He lay completely exhausted and could not move, but his face expressed deep joy. He lay there and thought about how he wouldn't be able to use this information in real combat because his head was ready to burst from the feelings overwhelming him. Too much information because of this skill being carried over and clogging up Suzumiya Kazda's head. But suddenly, Suzumiya Kazda realized that maybe it was because he hadn't decided what exactly he wanted to find. Suzumiya Kazda sat down on the ground and began to conceptualize his hunches. Gathering the rest of his strength, Suzumiya Kazda decided that he would try again. Suzumiya Kazda would spread his magical energy around himself and filter it with the skill of analyzing information. Realizing that he wouldn't be able to stand on his feet right now for a better effect, Suzumiya Kazda began to use his magic sitting down. He presented his hand to his forehead for better concentration and began to spread his energy throughout the forest. Suddenly, a status window appeared in front of the guy. It wasn't exactly a normal window. The way he manifested his magic had changed on its own, and now he was seeing an updated version. A status window that was like a circular map, but it only showed one object he was looking for up to a certain search range. But Suzumiya Kazda wasn't stupid, and decided that he could overlay the map to search for different objects on top of each other. And in the end, Kazda succeeded. Kazda succeeded in creating a primitive radar, but in his case, since he used his concentration magic, it was more than just a piece of work. He began to study the information that came to him. This magic was called perception magic. In total, he had 50 circular cards. The current range was up to 50 meters, and he would need more mana to extend the range. And since there was no cost to maintain this status, he could look around and use the information in active time. Looking at what he conjured in the status window and all the information he could get from there, the young man realized that now he wouldn't be ambushed like last time. After his analysis was over, Suzumiya Kazda remembered that 3 days ago, the owner of the gun shop said that he would give Suzumiya Kazda the sword when he finished it now. Suzumiya Kazda decided to finish his magic practices and decided to go to the man's place. After resting, he was curious to see what came out of the tempering process he prompted the man. It was sunny and warm outside. The street that Suzumiya Kazda walked along was familiar to him, but on this day, it was completely empty. Suzumiya Kazda habitually walked into the shop and said hello. Suzumiya Kazda immediately from the threshold asked how his sword was doing and smiled at the man. It seems that the owner of the weapon shop was completely tired because he was yawning. The man to all this said that the sword was already ready. He started to tell that his experience was amazing. Suzumiya Kazda didn't know that one could make such a thing by tempering coal iron that was recently released quite strong, and when the man tempered, his resulting iron proved to be stronger than any other special material. Suzumiya Kazda, standing in front of the counter, listened carefully to the man's words. Coal iron could be, he so-called steel. Apparently it was so it only meant that the man used to use wrought iron or something like that. Wrought iron after hardening would not show such a noticeable effect, unlike steel. The man remembered perfectly well that he had promised to give him the sword for free. Turning away from the young man, he decided to give him a certain sword. Apparently he had already chosen it. Taking out a sword in a black holster from under the counter, the man told him that he made it yesterday, and it was one of the man's best work. Suzumiya Kazda can use this sword until he obtains a special B-rank material. Satisfied with himself, the owner of the armory held out the sword in its scabbard to Kazda. The man's gaze said that he wanted to see Suzumiya Kazda work with that sword. But the young man taking the sword in his hands realized that he was holding this weapon for the first time and did not know how to wield it properly. But he could not refuse the man who had forged this sword for him. Standing in front of the counter, Suzumiya Kazda pulled the sword from its sheath. The steel glistened in the sun. The sword seemed most durable, and the hilt rested comfortably in his hands, even though he didn't know how to use it. The young man's body moved, submitted to some unknown force. Suzumiya Kazda, as if inwardly already knew how to hold the sword and how to properly place his feet. For a better strike swung the sword of an invisible opponent. It seemed that the men knew what he was doing. After performing these unsophisticated movements, Suzumiya Kazda stopped and wondered how his body could move so easily. The owner of the weapon shop rubbed his beard contentedly. Suzumiya Kazda was proud that he was able to make such a fine weapon and give it to an outstanding Kazda who would appreciate his work. The owner of the weapon shop said that the young man did not look like a beginner at all. Considering all his movements must have been before Suzumiya Kazda lost his memory, he was a swordsman. The young man smiled bashfully and covered his eyes as the man praised him and said that he could swing a sword, and also could become a much stronger swordsman. Suzumiya Kazda laughed and marveled at how incredible his talent was. It was an art. As the young man put his sword into its scabbard, he mouthed that this sword was good in his hand. And Suzumiya Kazda decided to clarify if he could really take it for free. The man looked at his work and said that it was a small price to pay, as he could now forge the ball much better than before, so the young man just had to take it. Remembering that the young man had recently shared with him such a secret technique, Suzumiya Kazda asked if the man really just wants to give Suzumiya Kazda such a great technology in the form of a sword. But Suzumiya Kazda said that he wouldn't even mind if the owner of the weapon shop spread this special technology. After all techniques are created to be used, and Kazda doesn't care at all, and it certainly won't get any worse if He-Man would be trained on this technique. The man was proud of such words from the young man. The man assured that if Suzumiya Kazda needed anything in the future, he would just need to come to this shop and let him know. The man would definitely help Suzumiya Kazda thanks to his kindness. But suddenly, the expression on the gun shop owner's face changed drastically. The man thought about the fact that Suzumiya Kazda was most likely not a magician. Only why had the gun shop owner never seen this young man in armor before? Suzumiya Kazda froze in surprise at those words. He was so satisfied with his bill last time that he didn't think at all about the fact that he needed to purchase armor as well. The young man replied to the man that he would like to use light armor that would not constrict his movements. The man said that in that case he would need leather armor. But there was no such armor in this shop. After all, the man only dealt in sheet metal armor, but he knew who Suzumiya Kazda could go to, because he was intimately acquainted with the master tanner. The young man smiled and nodded in approval. Suzumiya Kazda heard that when he came to the tannery he would need to specify what sent him, but for some reason the master cheered up the young man. Walking through the neighborhood in which the gunsmith's shop was located about whether or not the master tanner would be what kind of dwarf like the owner of the gun shop. Bells rang as the door to the leather shop opened. Suzumiya Kazda was wary, for he did not know what he should expect inside. He was greeted at the threshold by a pretty girl who said hello, and clarified whether Suzumiya Kazda was an adventurous newcomer. Coming deep inside the shop, Suzumiya Kazda thought of her as a clerk. Suzumiya Kazda smiled politely and confirmed. Yes, he was an adventurous newcomer. Suzumiya Kazda was recommended this shop by the owner of the gun shop. He said that if he needed armor, this was the most suitable place. The expression on the girl's face changed drastically at the mention of the armor master's shop. The girl didn't understand how she could be recommended to this guy. Suzumiya Kazda himself might be an adventurous newcomer. The girl saw that the man had a black sword scabbard in his hands, and she was very interested in them. So she clarified if she could take a look at this sword that was made by the shopkeeper himself. The man gladly held out the sword to her, confirming that she could take it for inspection. The girl took the sword from Suzumiya Kazuda's hands and quickly ran to her work table. Suzumiya Kazuda carefully. Watching her actions carefully thought that she most likely noticed all the small details that were carved on his sword. Carefully placing the sword on the counter of her work table, the girl began to go through the cloths. Taking one of them, she stood and looked in front of her, thinking about her next actions. Suddenly, the girl tosses a piece of cloth upwards, which greatly confuses the young man, who is still carefully watching what is happening. Immediately, the fragile girl turns around, slicing the cloth floating in the air with her sword before it could fall to the floor. This action gave Suzumiya Kazuda a huge shock. After the cloth had fallen to the floor, the girl began to touch the blade of the sword, which was quite sharp. Suzumiya Kazuda stood in anger. How could she use his weapon like that? While the girl was looking at the young man's sharp blade, he finally realized that there was no one else in this room. Apparently, this girl is the armor master that the owner of the armory had mentioned after checking the ball. The girl confirmed that the sword was real, but noticed that it was the first time she had seen such high-quality steel. Suzumiya Kazuda looked at the girl and didn't understand how she could call herself in the third person. Despite her appearance and small stature, she was quite skillful, and clearly had a knack for quality things. Passing the sword back to the owner, the girl said that a good ball needs good armor too. She asked the young man which of the materials he preferred. She was willing to do whatever he wished. Since this was the first time Suzumiya Kazuda had come to buy armor, he asked the master's advice on what materials she had in her shop. Walking up to one of the walls, the girl pointed to the hanging samples. For example, this one is called Gordon's leather. She pointed to the cloth in the middle. Armor made of it costs about 15,000 coins and has excellent protection. It can be compared to metal armor, but it's much easier to move around and doesn't have any weaknesses. Suzumiya Kazuda carefully looked at the cloth the girl was talking about. The guy was listening to her words very carefully as usual. The girl admired this leather so much, saying that I was her favorite. There are, of course, cheaper leather options. This was green wolf leather, but everyone knows very well that it has very low defense and is vulnerable to fire strikes. The young man knew this very well, as he had already used fire magic on these creatures. One hit of simple fire magic would be a disaster for him. Therefore, the girl would absolutely advise against purchasing armor made of this leather. Stopping to choose, the girl would say that she had no other materials, only these, and the choice here was quite obvious. There was nothing else left but to use Gordon's skin. The master was very pleased with herself, and since she was selling gear for budding adventurers, she didn't have the money to keep expensive items. But it didn't seem to bother her at all, and she was even proud of it. Looking around the room, the girl further talked to the guy. The girl told him that originally she worked only from the customer's materials and created armor from what she had. A black armor with a long cloak caught the young man's attention. Wanting to know more about it, he drew the girl's attention to the mannequin in the center of the room. The girl was pointing at the mannequin and smiling, but was acting a bit strange when she started talking about it. It was a particularly light armor, one that was created with the expectation that the wearer's magic power would be used without authorization, specifically to use automatic defense against magical attack. Well, when testing this suit, it turned out that the mana consumption was more than expected, so most people can only activate the defense magic for 30 minutes before it returns to its normal appearance. The young man listening to the description of this magnificent armor stared at it without looking away. Every word of the shopkeeper made his eyes shine more and more, and his desire to purchase this suit grew. That was why the armor became a decoration in her store. Kaz had a lot of fun using this suit. It was the perfect armor for him, because using mana to activate the defense mechanism proved to be a very good solution for him. Kaz liked this magnificent armor so much. Not only did it look elegant, but it also had quite a lot of functionality, and he decided to use his score skill on it. He looked at this armor without looking away. It was a prototype of a magical protective clothing, one that absorbed about 20 mana positions per hour. Ordinary adventurers couldn't utilize its full potential, but with the young man's natural regeneration being even greater than the mana consumption of the armor, it would be perfect for him. Getting closer to this armor, Suzumiya Kazuda began to ask questions. How good was this armor? How much was its cost? The girl hesitated for a moment. Since no one had asked such details about this armor yet, she thought that this armor was as strong as Gordon's hide. Therefore, she could offer it to him at the same price. The girl realized that Suzumiya Kazuda wanted to buy it and got scared. She folded her fingers and said that she was not advised to purchase it. Seeing how worried the girl was about him, the young man decided to calm her down. He just wants to try and use this armor in battle, and if it's too bad, he'll buy a regular leather armor. Hearing such a reassuring answer, the girl smiled widely, so everything would be fine, and if necessary, this young man would definitely come back to her. The girl quickly took the young man's measurements and prepared all the necessary tools to create his armor. It had to be ready by tomorrow evening. So she suggested that Kazda come over as soon as the evening bell rang. The young man understood. Suzumiya Kazda remembered that he needed to purchase a staff, so he asked the girl if she had anything other than armor. It was a rather strange question for the owner of a leather shop, because she had never been asked about staffs, but she knew where they were sold, so she advised to go to the store behind the next door. It was a magic store. Suddenly, there was a strange change on one of the walls. There, instead of the usual wallpaper, structural patterns began to appear. After all the changes, a beautiful carved door with a metal handle appeared on the wall. Suddenly, the door opened, and a nice girl with a staff in her hands and a huge black hat appeared from it. She cheerfully asked if the young people had called her. The magician girl's behavior was so abrupt and unexpected. Suzumiya Kazda was slightly dumbfounded by this development. It seemed that every moment of being in this world brought with it a feeling of unforgettable delight. Suzumiya Kazda was constantly surprised and delighted by something new, and it was here at every turn. But the girl who was a leather craftsman was very angry. She was yelling at the mage girl about not allowing her to enter her store, especially without warning. But the mage girl didn't understand why the owner of the leather shop was reacting so violently to her appearance. Such a strong anger, everything is fine and nothing terrible happened. This girl was a real magician. Her name was Ara. The girl with short hair was dressed like a witch from a fairy tale. She wore a dark dress and a black cloak. Her tall hat and staff in her hands, everything in her image was like a magic dream. The magician girl approached the young man and asked him if he needed a staff by any chance. While the young man's thoughts did not let go of his head, the owner of the leather shop answered instead. She told him that the young man had been recommended this place by Dovera himself, the owner of the armory. Was that man really that famous? Thought Suzumiya Kazda. He also really liked the look of that girl mage standing opposite him. The mage girl named Ara took the young man's hand and made him wildly excited. Such a sudden touch of the girl's hands made Suzumiya Kazda's palms sweat. Yes, he needed a staff. In that case, they needed to enter a magic store. The young mage girl cheerfully pulled Suzumiya Kazda into the door that had just appeared. It only took a couple steps to see her store. She sold many different things that could be useful to him in battles. No sooner had Suzumiya Kazda crossed the threshold than he was overcome with unforgettable feelings. The young man began to look around, and his eyes widened from the excitement he felt. There were lanterns flying all around him that illuminated their way. A tall, steep staircase climbed steeply straight up to the top. On the shelves were books with various magic spells. It seemed like all the magic of this world was concentrated right in this room. When looking at anything, it seemed to be alive, and the young man constantly sighed with delight. He was very surprised and amazed by everything that happened here. The girl stood in the middle of the room and waved her arms to the sides. She was determined to find out all the secrets and desires of this young man. With one of her hands, she was pointing in the direction where it was necessary to pay attention. Turning his head slightly, Suzumiya Kazda saw a wall on which hung a huge number of different staffs, and the girl Ara, approaching them, offered to choose the one that would help him. The guy's eyes went wild from such a huge selection. He had never seen so many kinds of staffs before. At first glance, he did not understand how they all differed, so he decided to ask Ara. The mage girl said that the main difference was the length of the staff. The longer the staff, the higher the speed of magic used by the person. The girl disconnected one of the staffs from the wall. There was one problem, which was that the longer the staff, the harder it was to control one's magic. Therefore, people usually chose one that was more comfortable for themselves. The standard length of staffs ranged from 60 to 120 centimeters. The staff chosen by the girl mage she passed into Kaz's hands. This was the slowest version. This staff was 60 centimeters long, but when magic is used, its speed will be multiplied tenfold. This staff was very well suited for small spaces like a dungeon. It really wouldn't need that much speed there, therefore it was best suited for use in enclosed spaces. After carefully listening to all the instruction and description of the staffs that were found here, Suzumiya Kazda thought about his choice. After a bit of thought, he understood everything perfectly and knew which staff he needed. Suzumiya Kazda's eyes lit up. He decided that he needed a staff that tripled his speed. The young man's words made the girls smile. No one had ever asked for a staff with such a small speed before. The girls could barely contain their laughter so as not to upset the man. The mage girl imagined what size the staff should be, and it would be a size of only 20 centimeters. She doesn't have a staff like that, and it would be useless since it couldn't hurt the enemy considering how little speed it gave out. Well, Suzumiya Kazda insisted that he needed a staff of that length. His magic was quite fast without the staff, so the acceleration would be enough, and considering that Suzumiya Kazda would be using a sword as well, he would need a staff of this size so that it wouldn't get in the way. The girl's expression changed dramatically. How can a mage use both a shield and a sword? She squinted her eyes to avoid laughing or cursing at the strangeness of this Suzumiya Kazda, but she was curious to see it, so the girl decided that she could make him such a staff, and it would be ready tomorrow. She liked this interesting man, but she immediately warned that she would not take responsibility if this staff turned out to be useless. Suzumiya Kazda stood silently and thought about the fact that all the words he said seemed strange, because this probably does not happen in this world. They stood in the middle of a huge room. The floor was laid with tiles in a staggered pattern. Air lanterns were still floating in the air. And Suzumiya Kazda was thinking about the fact that Sally also mentioned that people in this world needed to concentrate to use their magic, so most likely magic swordsmen are very rare in this world. Looking around, Suzumiya Kazda looked at the intricately shaped staff. In any case, he would be happy if this mage girl would make the staff he needed. That was the only thing he needed right now. In front of the guy stood that staff that he really liked, so he offered to just cut off 20 centimeters from the standing staff. The girl seemed to be torn apart by the guy's anger and uneducation. She was ready to scream at him out of anger. Getting up from the floor, the girl restrained her emotions and spoke very, very slowly so as not to scare the man. Staffs had different functions at all parts of its length, so shortening the staff would make it even more useless. Looking at the girl trying to calm down, the young man shifted his gaze to the one standing at the other end of the room, waiting for some explosion of emotion. While the girl was suffering from stomach pain due to a fit of hysterical laughter, Suzumiya Kazda stood joyful. He could already feel that 20-centimeter staff in his hands and thought about having all his equipment ready for tomorrow night. The boy couldn't wait to start using it. Later that afternoon, Suzumiya Kazda came to the guild. The young man stood behind the front desk as usual. He met Sally and she smiled at him welcomingly since they hadn't seen each other in a while. The girl asked the young man if he had some time she would like to offer to talk to him about rank promotion. Suzumiya Kazda stood in front of her and asked her again what rank promotion she was talking about. The girl continued. His contribution to the guild was deemed sufficient for a rank promotion, and also the superiors had recognized his good herb gathering and the incident in the forest with the green wolves. Well, there was one condition since this adventurer requires different experience. Kaz needed to fulfill at least one of the routine requests, be it janitor or loader, babysitter or gatherer. And after that, he could get his first promotion. So he needed to consider taking any of the above tasks if he wanted to get a promotion. Suzumiya Kazda didn't have any questions. He only thought that it was quite an interesting system. Walking over to where the task plaques were hanging, he began to study the wall. There were still quite a few different tasks on the wall, so he had a choice. He scrutinized all the inscriptions on the plates, but first he needed to find the tasks that belonged to his rank. One of the plaques caught his attention. It was scavenging and transportation of goods. This was something interesting. He apparently decided to use the inventory in the job and his magical skills. Taking the sign off the wall, Suzumiya Kazda walked up to the front desk and smiled. He picked a class and held out the sign to the girl to register it. How many questions did this girl have in her head after she read what this building was? To her it seemed rather strange, though all of this young man's choices and actions were strange. The sign said that it was a task for rank 6 transporting iron ore. The reward was 2 coins per kilogram transported, and there was a limited amount of it. Anyway, it shouldn't be a problem since transporting iron ore is also considered a chore, but this task was as unpopular as picking herbs. The girl tried to discourage Suzumiya Kazda by pointing out the obvious disadvantages of this task. There was a huge wait, and a great distance had to be traveled to fulfill this request. After all, there were better assignments, so she suggested that he consider other options. Paying attention to the girl's strange speech, he realized that this was a quest that didn't seem worth doing, but he tried to change her mind. After all, it would be fine considering he had a skill like inventory. Remembering that he had an inventory also reminded him that he didn't know how to use it and didn't know all of its characteristics. So he decided to ask a question about the inventory to Sally. The young man asked her how the capacity of the inventory was measured. The girl was happy to help him, so she told him that the capacity was related to the maximum magic level when first opened, as well as the maximum magic level when using that inventory. Suzumiya Kazda remembered that when he opened his inventory, he saw the same values as his magic level. It turns out that the number of slots he could have in his inventory is directly proportional with his magic level. And also each slot has a certain capacity limit related to the maximum magic level when he opens the inventory. The guy wondered how much weight he could put in his inventory, so he started stacking various things in there. This request was like a huge gain for him. Once Suzumiya Kazda realized this, he quickly said goodbye to Sally, thanked her, and left. Not far from the high mountains, a strange animal was sleeping in a clearing near the rocks. It was as cute as a kitten and a hare, but it had small horns on its head. Due to its big ears, this animal was very sensitive. As soon as it heard a noise in the distance, it broke out of its deep sleep and looked towards the source of the noise. It was Suzumiya Kazda who was running to test his stamina and speed. However, because of his high speed, he didn't notice what was going on around him. Therefore, the creature had to jump away from Suzumiya Kazda on its own to avoid a collision. Suzumiya Kazda's speed was now 20 kilometers per hour. With such a speed, he could easily win the Olympics. As Suzumiya Kazda ran, his thoughts did not leave him. Since he had already increased his level, he would be able to run without panting. The young man could have run all day, but he was completely unwilling to do so. Running past the stone mountains, he was on his way to complete his task. Seeing something unusual in front of him, Suzumiya Kazda slowed down his speed. In an empty, lifeless clearing next to the mountains stood a wooden gate. Entering this gate, he called out to a man with a sack on his shoulder. He told him that he had been sent here to fulfill a request from the guild. The short man didn't seem to be very happy about such an assistant and immediately demanded to see the guild's identification card. After carefully inspecting the identity card, the man made sure that this card looked at least believable. Since this matter was settled, the man led Suzumiya Kazda to the huge pile of iron ore. He told him that it was necessary to carry as much as he could. It was a huge mountain of black stones that was at least 3 times the height of a man. Deciding to leave Suzumiya Kazda alone with himself and his work, the man slowly walked away, but did not forget to watch that strange young man. Meanwhile, Suzumiya Kazda stood looking at the huge pile of ore that he needed to move. The man who was in charge of the place thought that Suzumiya Kazda looked very weak and that such hard work would probably not be good for him. There was some strange music going on around the place, a melody that kept growing and growing. When the man looked up, his eyes widened and his mouth opened randomly, because what he saw was shocking him. At the same time, Suzumiya Kazda, who was on the ore, was stacking all the stones he could in his inventory. The man left his sack lying on the ground from such a surprise and asked just how much could fit in this young man's inventory right now. Suzumiya Kazda briefly thought and said that it was about 1,500 kilograms. There's no way for the inventory to be that big. Even a man who is constantly engaged in working with iron ore can only carry up to 200 kilograms. With this information, Suzumiya Kazda learned what the standard of inventory in this world was. Trying to answer without hurting anyone, he said that his inventory was probably just more spacious than others. Frankly speaking, he hadn't checked how much more he could fit in there. As Suzumiya Kazda climbed higher and higher putting ore into his inventory, the man thought about the fact that they were short on carriers for a number of reasons. But be that as it may, the man would appreciate it if this young man continued to help them in transporting iron ore in the future, but Suzumiya Kazda couldn't promise him that, because he himself didn't know how long he could still stay in this city. Looking carefully at the statistics of his inventory, the young man saw that it was already full. 2,012 kilograms was not a small amount, but not much for him either. The man exhaled quietly. That's quite a lot of weight that he could stack his inventory, and he was glad that finally the guy's inventory space had run out. But it turned out it wasn't that simple because the young man was still collecting ore. But how could that be possible with a full inventory? It turned out that only 1 slot was filled in this way. The young man happily turned around because he knew that he still had enough space. The man could not believe what he had heard. Over 2,000 kilograms, and it was only 1 slot. All of this seemed unbelievable to him. Meanwhile, the coal mountain was rapidly shrinking. The man called Suzumiya Kazda some kind of chest incarnation or something like that, because such a huge amount of ore couldn't manage to fit his inventory, yet not a single person. From the place where Suzumiya Kazda collected the stone ore, there was a smelter, and there were very loud shouts. Someone was calling their boss and calling to see what was going on. There were 3 people in the room, and all were staring with their mouths wide open with amazement upwards. The last stone of this ore was coming out of the young man's hand. At last he had taken every last pebble out of his bottomless inventory. A huge barrel made of bricks was stuffed to the top with coal, and in the end the young man managed to collect 10 tons of coal. Everyone came up to this barrel and looked at some unimaginable miracle. The oldest man, who apparently was the boss in this company, realized that the vault was full. He shouted very loudly to everyone that the work was finished, since there would be enough coal for a long time. The man asked Suzumiya Kazda, who was standing upstairs, how many moves he had made. The young man smilingly said that it was only 1 trip. To himself, he thought to himself that he could have endured many more. But the man who had hired him for the job had stopped him after he had filled the 5th slot. The man talked about how if Suzumiya Kazda took more, they wouldn't have room for storage. In the meantime, they have so much charcoal, and I'll have to create a new request. Kazda was a bit hurt since he had lost such a good request on the first day. Freed from his work, Kazda went straight to the guild to turn in his work. He brought the card to the guild branch. The girl Sally who took his request was very angry at what she saw. It said that he had brought 10 tons of coal. How was that even possible? After the guild's evaluation was over, he was promoted. He was now rank 5. Suzumiya Kazda stood by the front desk waiting for his money and decided not to worry about anything since Sally had probably warned everyone about him. The next day, Suzumiya Kazda came to the shop, where his new armor and short staff were waiting for him. The girls were talking amongst themselves. One was happy that the armor would fit this young man perfectly. The mage girl, on the other hand, was frustrated. She didn't know how it would be possible to use such a short dewlap, and so Suzumiya Kazda's equipment was completely ready. What he was wearing was more than enough. He looked very chic. His face was well accentuated by that huge hood of his cloak, and the black leather of the armor blended perfectly with his fair skin. The mage girl held out a short wand to the young man, but she was worried that this wand wouldn't be able to help him in any way. The appearance of the wand matched his costume completely. The black handle and the light-colored long tip looked very magical. Suzumiya Kazda took his new staff in his hands and began to examine it. This staff seems quite nice to him. After Kazda's words, the Ara girl couldn't stand it and laughed throughout the room. After leaving the armorer's shop in his new guise, Suzumiya Kazda decided to test his abilities. He was so fast that it seemed that he did not touch the earth with his fingers, but simply floated in the air. Since he was fully equipped, Suzumiya Kazda decided to test himself in battle. No matter how scared he was, he wanted to fully test his full strength, so he decided to go as deep into the forest as he could. During his journey, Suzumiya Kazda used the radar that he himself created a few days ago, and when he heard some strange sound, he realized that he needed to go exactly in the direction of the movement that is indicated. It was there in the distance, in the thickest part of the forest, was a huge pack of green wolves. The wolves were very many dozens, rather hundreds or even several hundred, and all of them had sensed this Suzumiya Kazda. The entire pack of wolves turned their heads and bared their fangs. Some of them began to howl, calling the others to fight. As if mesmerized, Suzumiya Kazda looked at the green wolves. It was the perfect prey to test his skills. Getting closer and closer to this pack, the young man thought about how many wolves were here. Maybe 300? No, most likely, and there are about 500 here. That's too many. But would he be able to handle it alone? Kazda thought. Should he leave the battlefield after all? But he can't leave now. They might follow him and he might lead them straight to the city. And no one wanted that kind of trouble. Preparing his palm to use Suzumiya magic, Kazda realized that he had no choice but to fight this pack of green wolves. Above Kazda's palm appeared 3 vials with some potions. From just his thought, the corks opened and flew up above the vials. And the pack of green wolves watched the young man's movements intently. It was ready to attack. At any second, their eyes were already glistening with rage and poisonous foam was pouring from their mouths. The young man drank the potion that appeared in his palms. It was a magic mana regeneration acceleration potion, which was covered in dust in the magic shop. It accelerated the natural regeneration of mana tenfold for 3 hours. Suzumiya Kazda took in his hand the staff he had just been made. The small magic wand was a useless item for ordinary magicians, but not for him. Suzumiya Kazda stood in front of a huge pack of green wolves. All the wolves started their movement towards the young man. They were in no hurry. The wolves were confident that with such a large number, they could defeat the enemy very quickly. Suzumiya Kazda was ready for the attack. He had long ago made a plan for his battle against the green wolves. His face radiated confidence, and movement and gait were precise. One of the huge wolves advanced forward. He bared his teeth, showing his superiority to the young man. He looked very much like the leader of the pack. The young man was not at all intimidated by the number of opponents that dominated him. With the help of enhanced magic, he created stone spears from the ground, which flew, hitting the opponents very quickly. The earth simply came to life and turned into a tool to defeat the wolves. Suzumiya Kazda was very focused, constantly saying incantation and turning the ground into a killing tool. The stone spears were very effective, especially with the increased magic. They flew from the top to the sides. They hit the wolves in various parts of their bodies in just seconds, and most of the green wolves died before they even realized they were under attack. The stricken wolves screamed in pain. They howled, opening their huge mouths, but it didn't help them. They tried to dodge, but there were more and more spears. They came from all directions, and it was impossible to keep track of them. Suzumiya Kazda, satisfied with himself, put his hand forward and conjured more and more magic items. It was working. The plan he had come up with was working like clockwork. After all, when he researched magic, he learned 5 things about it. Suzumiya Kazda could channel more magic mana into his magic, and thus he increases its firepower. But he could also manage a maximum of 10 mana per second, although channeling 10 times more mana into it doesn't increase the area of effect tenfold. The young man decided to get closer to his opponents and launched himself into a run. He released several fireballs to attack several monsters at once. He could also use several spells while accelerating at the same time. Suzumiya Kazda used an earth and fire spell, thus releasing a huge number of fireballs and destroying his opponents not only with stone spears, but also with fireballs. He now saw in front of him not just a pack of green wolves. Suzumiya Kazda saw animals that were burning thanks to the fact that he could use his fire magic. He was destroying all living things that met in his path. The wolves were burning, they were falling and jumping, trying to knock themselves off the fire. But it would not go away. The wolves screamed and suffered in pain. Everything around them blended into one bloody picture. Meanwhile, the young man was using his magic to full power. He touched that ground to release stone spears, then stretched his arm up to release fireballs. Suzumiya Kazda tried to attack in any way possible to defeat such a huge group of monsters. Suzumiya Kazda stepped on the burning ground and flames flashed around his feet. But thanks to his new armor, he wasn't burned, and the fire couldn't do him any harm. This made his attack even more effective. He had already destroyed enough monsters, but he was not harmed himself. Flying stone arrows constantly flashed around him, and a field of defeated animals spread out in front of him. The green wolves were running towards the young man, trying to evade the attack. But the closer they got to Kazda, the fewer they became. At one point, the young man reached the pack of surviving wolves. The pack of surviving monsters managed to surround him. Suzumiya Kazda couldn't stop in time. Therefore, he was surrounded by furious animals on 3 sides. At that moment, he tried to pull out a sword from his inventory, which quickly enough appeared already in his hand. The expression on his face meant that he was scared, but he tried to keep his composure. And now, already defending himself with his account holding a huge steel shield, the young man was surrounded by his magic, which together with him attacked the surviving wolves. The pack of green wolves were jumping so high that they could easily bite the head off with a single jump. The animals were getting closer and closer to each other. The battle was heating up. But this was a battle the wolves could not win. Not even a second had passed before the wolves that had attacked the young man were left with only cooling bodies in the air. Still flying were the remains of animals. Some were chopped apart. Some had their heads chopped off. But all of them were defeated, while the young man didn't have a single scratch on him. By the time the battle was over, night had already fallen over the forest. Only the treetops were still illuminated by the sunlight. Suzumiya Kazda was sitting on a huge rock. He tiredly lowered his hands to his knees. There was not a single sound around him. His new armor was dirty. He himself was covered in small scratches. But Suzumiya Kazda exhaled tiredly and realized that it couldn't have been any other way. Nothing else was what he had expected. It could have been precisely the victory over the green wolves. All the animals that attacked him, they were coming straight at him head on. The young man was sitting on a huge rock, and a huge number of animal corpses were lying around him. They formed a huge field of furry bodies. Wiping the blood off his face, someone still from the wolves managed to inflict damage on the young man. Suzumiya Kazda realized that only 3 minutes had passed at first of their battle. Thanks to magic, the scratch had healed very quickly and there was no trace of it on his face. Only the dirt appeared during the battle. Suzumiya Kazda smiled and thought that those 3 minutes were not wasted at all. He had increased the amount of his magic power as well as his vitals. His intelligence had increased. He had increased levels such as analyzing information, complete mastery of otherworldly language, and all kinds of talents. Talent for magic, talent for martial arts, and talent for all kinds of magic. Fire magic was level 3, water magic was level 3, earth magic was level 3, perception magic was level 3, pressure magic was level 3, and recovery magic was also level 3. Examining his guild card, he saw that 513 wolves had been defeated. This was quite a lot. Could it be that the green wolves were gathering in such huge packs? This was the question that was currently troubling the young man. All the data from this battle was displayed on his guild map, and the number 513 was displayed there, which meant the number of defeated wolves. Nothing was hidden from the guild. Suzumiya Kazda thought about where such a battle would lead to. He had been very careless in not consulting with the rest of the guild before going on the offensive against the huge pack of green wolves. But that was completely unimportant. The young man got up from the stone and decided that he would inform Sally-san when he returned to the city. The sight around Kaede was intimidating. A huge number of animal corpses were lying in the middle of the forest, and the young man himself didn't look good. After looking around in the middle of the huge field of corpses, the young man decided to gather it all into his inventory first. As if by magic, the animal corpses began to disappear. There was a huge noise from heavy paws in the depths of the forest. The ground shook. The huge paws of an incomprehensible monster crumbled everything they touched. With a single step, pits formed under the monster's feet. The monster's tail was so long and powerful. Like scales, a metallic shell covered it. The edges of these scales were as sharp as steel. There was no doubt that when they met, no one would survive a single blow. All the monsters that were hiding in this forest would flee in fear. Even the green wolves were afraid of this monster. A massive monster advanced through the forest. Its body was covered with metal plates. In terms of height and size, it was not inferior to those seen earlier in this forest. This monster was like a huge lizard. As soon as the young man appeared at the guild branch and showed the steel clan card, Sally started screaming for some reason. The girl was angry with him. She asked Suzumiya Kaede with all importance and seriousness how he could kill 513 green wolves. She couldn't understand where he could find such a huge number of animals, but Suzumiya Kaede stood there and tried to calmly justify himself. He talked about finding them after 15 minutes of walking through the forest. Was it really that strange to find 513 wolves? The girl was confused. She held the guild's clan map in her hands and thought about how green wolves didn't usually gather in such huge packs. The norm for the number of wolves in one pack was around 100, but 500 was already abnormal. The young man took the map of the clan in his hands, thinking that he was very unlucky, or maybe on the contrary, he was lucky. He had gained quite a lot of experience from the battle with the wolves. The girl thought deeply about the situations that had happened. After all, this wasn't the first situation where Suzumiya Kaede, standing in front of her, did something that others couldn't before. But raising her head up and looking at the cute man, the girl was glad that he was in one piece. Anyway, she offered to sell him the corpses of the green wolves. At the moment, she could buy about 100 or so. The young man agreed. 100 wolves for sale was a good deal. After visiting the guild clan, the young man decided to head to the weapons shop to have his weapons inspected and put in proper shape. The young man was pleased to see the elderly owner of the armory. Suzumiya Kaede greeted him politely and asked him to check the condition of his sword and shield. The man obediently agreed and asked to take the sword out of its sheath for inspection. The sword and shield were quite well damaged, much to the dismay of the owner of the armory. While he was inspecting the damage, he was forming a rough picture of the young man's battle in his head. After voicing his assumptions out loud, the gunshop owner guessed that Suzumiya Kaede was hunting the green wolves, and it looked like he had been hunting them for more than 2 days. Suzumiya Kaede decided to ask the man questions about weapons and hunting. The gunshop owner raised his sword to the light, examining all the scratches and cracks that had appeared on it during the battle. The green wolf's hide was quite tough, so it had done visible damage to the weapon. While the owner of the armory was examining the weapon in the glitter of the sword, he could examine himself. He told him that he could tell from the scratches on his shield that the green wolves had done it. It was not the first time he had seen such damage from the teeth of those animals. He could tell from the sword that he had killed many monsters, and that it looked as if he had slaughtered more than 100 of them. The next words of the owner of the armory brought the young man to delight. After all, when the man first saw this Kaede, he thought the man was not capable of such a feat, but the man was glad that he had not hoped and believed in this man for nothing, and so Kaede liked that this blacksmith was so amazing. Not really wanting to praise himself, Suzumiya Kaede talked about how he thought he worked the ball correctly. That was why his status was elevated. But the man was talking about the opposite. Even if his status increased, he didn't think he had increased enough for Kaede to become a better sword swinger. After a while of waiting for Suzumiya, Kaede heard that all the inspections and repairs to his weapon had been completed. He was glad to interrupt the monotonous sounds of repairs. From doing nothing, the young man was already starting to get bored. Suzumiya Kaede thanked the man who had brought out his sword. The owner of the armory said that he had repaired the sword, but the shield was still fine. Even though the repairs had been made, the man asked Suzumiya Kaede to be careful. Handing the sword to the owner, the man advised him to change it. Suzumiya Kaede raised his gaze from his weapon to the man standing in front of him. He didn't understand why. After all, until a few days ago, the man had issued him a better sword. The owner of the armory had talked about how if a sword is pretty strong, but it's still iron, and it's much weaker than a sword made of special metal or rare monster material. Considering all of the young man's skills, he should carry a backup. After listening to everything the weapons shopmaster told him, Suzumiya Kaede thought about the rare monster materials. Could it really be something like a dragon? He would really like to wear a defense weapon created from that magnificent creature. Suzumiya Kazda thought about how a dragon sword would be the perfect aid in his battles. So the young man decided to clarify what would be the cost for the dragon sword. The man calmly replied that if it was a dragon sword, it would cost at least 4 billion coins. Such a huge amount of money made Suzumiya Kazda involuntarily open his mouth. He didn't know that dragons only have 5 body parts suitable for creating a ball, which made it difficult to obtain the necessary elements to create a strong weapon. As for the dragons themselves, they are so rare that they are considered legendary, and honestly, man can't put a price on these things. After all, if a dragon were to appear out of nowhere right now, some countries would be destroyed, and the world around everyone would be thrown into chaos, and so would this little town. Could it be that dragons were so strong, and dragon material was so strong that it would most likely be very difficult to obtain, thought Suzumiya Kazda. So he decided to clarify what type of material he should best choose for his new sword. After all, there must be something of the same quality as the dragon material, and at a more reasonable price. The owner of the armory looked at the young man and thought about what was most important to him in a sword. Most likely it was its sharpness. After all, a sharp sword slays its victims very quickly, and a mage's speed should be at a high level. The owner of the armory looked very tired, so he sat down on the nearest chair in his workshop and yawned. Yes, a material that wasn't inferior to the dragon's quality existed. That material is made from the shell of an iron lizard. But Suzumiya Kazda didn't know absolutely which animal this man was talking about, so he decided to ask him for more details. The metal that covered the lizard's skin. It was what was needed for the sword. However, these lizards are really tough and ordinary swordsmen don't stand a chance against them. If one of these creatures appeared in a small town with a couple mages like this, there would be a bloodbath. And if Suzumiya Kazda wants the owner of a weapon shop to make a sword out of this material, the price would be around 5 million coins. Besides, in terms of physiological resistance, a metal lizard shell is much better than dragon scales. Suzumiya Kazda listened attentively to everything he was told by just that man and thought about how powerful these lizards were. But something was upsetting him in those words. What did it matter how powerful they were and how strong the material on them was, and if he couldn't find them anyway? Even if he decided to hunt them, it would be far in the future, not now. It seemed to him that he was completely unprepared to fight such powerful creatures. The next day, a huge number of people gathered around the guild branch. On this clear, warm day, for some reason, everyone was going there. People were constantly whispering. But upon approaching the gates of the branch, Suzumiya Kazda realized that the guild was closed. On the huge walls of the building hung a notice amongst which a huge number of people were crowded together. Everyone was curious to know why the gates were closed and no one was inside. Suzumiya Kazda looked at the sign, trying to decipher the language in which the important information was written. The announcement was clearly hanging there for a reason. After translating what was written on the sign, Kazda's eyes rounded. At first, he couldn't even believe what he had just read, namely that there was an emergency at the guild branch. Any adventurer who could fight was asked to come to the forest gate. They needed help. Apparently, there was some kind of serious attack since they were summoning all the free people. Suzumiya Kazda did not hesitate to go to the place indicated. There were already a huge number of adventurers gathered near the forest gate. Be it girls or guys, elderly people, hunters, and mages. Everyone had gathered at the huge gate and were building defense blocks. Everyone was busy with their work, and everyone was walking warily, as if fearing an attack. People were walking as fast as if they were running out of time. The adventurers who were guarding the city were always whispering about something. Apparently, something quite scary had happened, because the expression on all the adventurers' faces was frightening. Sally was also there. She was rushing to help everyone in need, but suddenly she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was Suzumiya Kazda. The girl didn't expect him to come to their aid. After all, he was new and didn't have to help a foreign city. The expression on Sally's face expressed worry and joy at seeing the young man. Suzumiya Kazda stopped and asked what was their problem. What was this urgent gathering for? Sally told him that after he told her about the Green Wolves yesterday, the head of their town's branch had decided to send some adventurers out on a reconnaissance mission. What the scouts discovered put the town under martial law. The adventurers discovered that there was a mob of monsters coming this way. It was only thanks to Suzumiya Kazda that they had time to prepare. The girl thanked him sincerely. After all, his battle with the huge pack of green wolves yesterday was not in vain. So now all the adventurers were gathering at the border of the forest to fight the mob of monsters that were about to enter this town. From the way she said it, looks like it was a huge group of monsters. It was good that they noticed early, otherwise this town would have been destroyed in a huge battle. The young man decided to clarify a few questions. Will it be a defensive battle, or do they have to attack and kill the enemy? No, there was confirmation that there were Gorgons known for their high piercing power. If they only defended the gate, the walls would be destroyed. So Sally asked Kaz to help on the front lines and destroy as many monsters as possible. Of course, all participants would be rewarded, and she asked to leave the gate to the newcomers. But Suzumiya Kazda was a rookie. Why would they want him on the front lines? That's right, he was a rookie, but only in the sense that he had just become an adventurer. But he was probably one of the most powerful adventurers in this city. While Sally and Suzumiya Kazda were standing around talking about the upcoming battle, a huge number of people were preparing for a defensive battle against the approaching monsters. The girl tearfully said that their surroundings always had only the weakest monsters. Therefore, this was the weakest branch of the guild, and the smallest. They never had adventurers with high skill levels. Such a revelation struck Kaz very hard. He now understood why he saw people with equally low skill levels when using the Analyze skill. The young man listened to the girl begging him to help them and get in the front lines for a more active battle with the monsters. Suzumiya Kazda lowered his head. He knew information swirled his thoughts more than usual, but he was well aware that it was impossible to procrastinate. Retreat was out of the question, so there was only one outcome: to agree. The girl who saw Suzumiya Kazda agreeing to help them thanked him. Sally's face immediately became more joyful. He would be one of the strongest soldiers supporting their plan. But the girl heartily asked him to be more careful. She absolutely did not want him to get hurt in this battle. Behind the young men, familiar voices could be heard. They were the two guards who had escorted the elderly merchant and Sally into town the last time they had met. The two boys approached the girl and said they were fully prepared. While Sally turned her attention to the guards who approached, Suzumiya Kazda turned in the opposite direction from them. The girl was happily telling the guards that Suzumiya Kazda had agreed to fight with them on the front lines, and they needed to move out already. But as soon as Sally turned her head, she saw the young man moving away, and it made her very upset. But Kazda apparently had plans of his own, so he decided to run away from the border, on which all the adventurers were now standing to protect the city. Suzumiya Kazda decided to run. The young man's speed was astonishing. His focused face spoke of the seriousness of his intentions. His cloak, driven by the wind of speed, seemed to float behind Suzumiya Kazda's back. Looking back at the fleeing young man, Sally and the guards stared with an uncomprehending look. They looked with huge eyes and thought that this man just decided to run away from the upcoming battle. Why would this Suzumiya Kazda run away when the town needed help? After all, this was exactly the time when they needed him more than ever, especially Sally. And after just a minute, Suzumiya Kazda was already in the forest where only the echo of his breathing could be heard. At first glance, it seemed like the entire forest had died out. The young man tried to quietly call out to the adventurers who might be here. He whizzed past the trees at such a great speed that only the wind that was generated by his movement could be noticed. Not even the rustling of the grass from the young man's feet could be heard. Only the whistle of his cloak whizzing past. As he ran, he kept thinking about the fact that Sally had asked him to go to the front of the line, and also that the girl had asked him not to get hurt. But it was a completely impossible request for him. It probably means that she expects a lot from him. Suzumiya Kazda ran through the trees and his feet almost didn't touch the ground. It was as if he was floating above the ground. But despite all his bad thoughts, Suzumiya Kazda was very attached to this city already. While the young man was moving towards his opponents, he was taking magic potions to increase his strength. Especially this was a good chance to gain a lot of experience, which he so desperately needed. Suzumiya Kazda decided that he would be the one to stop the monsters from invading the city. He would not let anyone get hurt. The young man was completely confident in himself. Releasing the potion bottles from his hands, they instantly disappeared into his inventory. This was a completely different Suzumiya Kazda. This young man was so serious that he no longer looked like someone who had recently been in the real world and spent all his free time playing computer games. He was already a man who was responsible for the people around him and for his own life. Suzumiya Kazda was running, farther and farther away from the town in search of whoever was trying to attack them on this beautiful town. Even though he drank the acceleration potion, the recovery of magic mana was not limitless. If he used his current magic experience to the best of his ability, he would only be able to last for about 20 minutes. The radar he had created, which he always used for various missions, began to emit warning sounds. The radar was warning Suzumiya Kazda that there were already various monsters nearby. Dots appeared on the radar screen, indicating the enemies. There were a huge number of them, and they were approaching at a breakneck speed. Suzumiya Kazda ran into an open clearing, in the middle of which was a huge pack of green wolves. These animals were all already running towards him. They were so angry and scared that they were ready to tear even the air that was in the way. As usual, the pack of green wolves tried to split into groups of several individuals and attack their prey from all sides. But Suzumiya Kazda is fully prepared for this battle from his inventory. In the blink of an eye appeared sword and shield that he will now use for his defense and attack on the monsters. As he got closer and closer to the pack of green wolves, he knew that he would kill these monsters at the swing of his sword. And so he did. The swing of the sword was so fast that it left only a metallic glint behind it, and the green wolves scattered in different directions, defeated by such skillful and dexterous movements. Also at this time, the stone spears created by earth magic flew at the opponents. They were even sharper and faster than the previous time. Since in the previous battle with the monsters, the young man had earned enough experience to develop his skills. Those who couldn't be killed with swords were killed by the stone spears that flew at the wolves from all directions. With the help of magic, Suzumiya Kazda would definitely hit anyone trying to attack the city. And now the last green wolves were falling to the ground from the lances of stone spears. They didn't have time to deal damage to something that could ruin them without even getting close. The poor animals screamed in pain, but their cries quickly subsided. The radar that Suzumiya Kazda used to search for his opponents nervously beeped, showing the rapid approach of some monster to the clearing where the corpses of the defeated animals already lay. Looking towards the indicator blinking on Suzumiya, Kazda's radar saw a huge boar approaching him. This was the size of an animal he had never seen in his life. This boar was no less angry than the green wolves before him. It seems that someone had scared him, and now he wanted to show his superiority over the weaker creatures. Suzumiya Kazda looked at it with a frightened look. The animal was bearing down on the man with its huge hooves, not even intending to stop. The young man had no choice but to move out of the way and devise a plan to defeat the monster during his time away. Suzumiya Kazda looked with his huge eyes towards the monster that almost knocked him down with its tusks. He looked like a scared boy now, not a man. But Suzumiya Kazda didn't lose his composure for long and came to his senses in a split second. Suzumiya Kazda took out his magic staff from his inventory. The young man created several stone spears with a slight movement of his hand, and with a precise movement of the staff, he aimed them directly at the boar. The stone spears hit the target accurately. Suzumiya Kazda still had time to hit the boar in the neck to make it lose its balance faster and fall to the ground. It seemed that in that instant, the boar was trying to stop to raise its hoof for the kick and keep its balance. The boar was much stronger than the green wolves, therefore it could not be defeated with a single strike of stone spears and a shield. Such an attack by a human against him only made the boar angry, and thanks to the rage that boiled inside the boar even more, the animal increased the speed of its attack on the enemy. But Suzumiya Kazda did not give up. The young man stood in a fighting stance, defending himself, realizing that the lives of the people in the city and his own would depend on his movements. Suzumiya Kazda looked at the approaching boar and could not understand why his stone spears had no effect. The boar was still just as alive and strong. The monster stood in front of the man, ready to attack and destroy all living things in its path. The boar did not stop at all, so Kazda had to bounce to the side to avoid a direct collision with the animal. The swipes of the boar's tusks could kill a person with the worst fighting skills. Suzumiya Kazda realized that defeating this monster required something more than what he had done before when killing green wolves. Apparently this was the monster that Sally-san mentioned, thought the young man, while rolling over the bare ground avoiding the strikes of the oncoming monster. Therefore, Suzumiya Kazda decided to use his analyze skill. Next to the approaching boar that roared with anger, its status window appeared. The boar's life force level was already incomplete, but still the life force level was still quite high, over 2,000 units. Therefore, it would take more time to deal with him than the green wolves. But Suzumiya Kazda apparently didn't expect anything else. It took 7 stone spears to reduce the huge boar's health by only 30%, and he could kill 10 green wolves with those spears. The boar didn't seem to care at this moment what his opponent thought of him. The only thing he wanted to do was to destroy his opponent. The huge monster was ready to sizzle him with his fierce gaze if he could. While the boar was trying to attack the young man, he felled several trees near him. They stood opposite each other, each of them threatening to stand to the last and kill their rival with a single blow. Both were waiting to see who would attack first, neither daring to make the first move. Suddenly, Suzumiya Kazda realized that he would need to use some new magic in order to defeat his opponent. With just the power of thought alone with the help of magic, he succeeded. The animal's vitality level was at 0, and the boar dropped dead. Suzumiya Kazda stood astonished and watched as the huge boar fell down. Had he really won? Was there a fatal wound? There couldn't have been none. That was the only explanation for how he was able to hit 70% of this boar's health. They had vaporized just instantly, but that wasn't interesting anymore, now that he was standing as the victor. In the middle of the field, where a huge amount of corpses of slain monsters were lying around, it didn't matter. What he was interested in was the movement of the monsters. Suzumiya Kazda decided to take that boar into his inventory. And while that one disappeared, the young man stood and pondered over the direction of movement. While collecting the remains of the animals on the battlefield, Suzumiya Kazda thought about the fact that unlike that group of green wolves he had met the other day, these monsters he met now on his path were running just straight ahead. Of course, he didn't know much about monster behavior, but he could sense that they were running away from something. He could see the fear in their eyes. Suzumiya Kazda thought that if he went to where they were running from, he could understand the reason for everything that was happening. Apparently, he was serious, because his eyes said that he was beginning to remember the direction of the monsters. Kazda's palms clenched tightly with tension. It seems he had decided to make some serious move and was preparing for it. Pushing off the ground very hard, Suzumiya Kazda flew up so high that his body was above the trees. From the intense pressure on the ground, a hole appeared in the place of the young man's foot. Bouncing so high, it seemed as if he was flying. Suzumiya Kazda had risen so high above the trees that if he was being watched from the ground, the people below would have mistaken him for a bird, and the cloak that was billowing in the wind was his wings. Suzumiya Kazda rose above the trees and soared. Spinning around his axis, he surveyed the area. Detecting the moving monsters, he realized all the animals were running towards the city, and that not only monsters were running, but birds and ordinary animals as well. Now he had no doubts. They were obviously scared by something. What Suzumiya Kazda saw from his bird's eye view was that even the green wolves were terrified. They tried to run alongside their brethren for more protection and as fast as possible. Their huge paws were going over and even interfering with each other because of the tremendous speed. The animals were screaming and moaning. Huge packs of different species all ran away as if someone wanted to kill them. They weren't fighting each other as they might have in normal times. They were frightened by something and forced to move together to save themselves. Landing back on the ground, Suzumiya Kazda realized that all his assumptions were confirmed. The monsters were running away from someone. But the young man did not have time to finish his thoughts as he suddenly heard some scary sound. Looking in the direction from which the sound came from, the guy turned pale. On the side where all the monsters ran out of the forest came out of some monster. It was bigger than all the others, and Suzumiya Kazda cautiously looked out from behind the tree trunk to remain unnoticed. That monster was killing everyone in its path. Therefore, the other monsters were putting a huge amount of effort into surviving. They scattered wherever they could while the ruthless giant monster caught up with them. The monster emerged from the thicket into a wide clearing, crushing the animals like berries with its huge paws. With its claws, the monster was digging into the body of anyone who got in its way. Even the terrifying green wolf cried out in pain and was much smaller than the paw that was killing it. Turning on his analysis skills, Suzumiya Kazda looked at this monster from a different angle. This monster was an iron lizard. Its life force level was low at only 2,800 units, but its strength was greater than all the other monsters. It was stepping on all living creatures as if it was helping it walk. Its huge tail was more like a metal spear with lots of jagged edges, and in the mouth of the monster could fit a whole house, and it seems that this animal threatened all living things with its scream. After reading the status window with the skill Analyze this iron lizard, Suzumiya Kazda rejoiced. After all, this was exactly what he was looking for. What a wonderful coincidence it was that Suzumiya Kazda had stumbled upon this monster. The iron lizard was the exact monster that the owner of the weapon shop had mentioned. Now, Suzumiya Kazda had no doubt that he would kill it and take its corpse with him to create the strongest weapon. Even though this lizard had a lower level of vitality than the boar that Suzumiya Kazda had just met, it would most likely be much harder to smash because of its metal armor. Suzumiya Kazda climbed up the tree, wanting to remain unnoticed. The young man wanted to think hard about his plan of attack, since all the other monsters were just running away from the lizard. Suzumiya Kazda needed to come up with a plan good enough that he could fight and not get killed standing in the way of the metal lizard. But he realized that it didn't make sense since he was alone. Suzumiya Kazda wouldn't be able to do it alone. He decided that rushing into battle alone was a bad idea. He would most likely need to go back and report this to the guild and not come here alone. Kazda's inner senses were well developed, so he noticed that the lizard was looking right at him, and Suzumiya Kazda felt scared. He felt with all his gut the strength and power of this monster, and the gaze was penetrating to the core. Judging by the look of the huge metal lizard, it was too late to look for ways to retreat. It spotted Kazd, who was in a tree making plans to destroy it. Now the plan of destruction was ripening in the metal lizard's mind. Apparently, the iron monster wanted to show Kazda sitting on the tree its power and superiority. Therefore, the iron lizard opened its mouth wide and let out a battle cry, which was both frightening and warning. No one could hide from the cold heart of this lizard. The iron lizard bent straight down to the ground, and with its mouth wide open, it was demonstrating that it was preparing to attack its victim. The huge horn on the lizard's nose was sharp, and the victim would fall on it, then it would easily pierce its body. Suzumiya Kazda was scared because he hadn't yet come up with a plan where he could defeat such a huge monster. The guy knew that the monster's speed skill was higher than his, and no matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to escape. In any case, that metal monster would catch up with him. Thoughts were spinning at a tremendous speed in Suzumiya Kazda's head, but none of them were able to come up with a suitable outcome. Despite all this, Suzumiya Kazda descended from the tree with a huge jump and was going to try to escape from the metal lizard. In this way, he was trying to buy time to think of a plan to save himself. Suzumiya Kazda was well aware that the monster would catch up with him, so he had to think fast. No matter how fast Suzumiya Kazda could run, compared to the other monsters, the metal lizard was catching up to him. He didn't have time to think of a plan or escape. The monster's tongue was already touching the fleeing Kazd. A sword and shield appeared from the arsenal, but given the size of the lizard, they would not be able to help save its master's life. The lizard was catching up to Kazd, so retreating was definitely not an option to be used. While Suzumiya Kazda was running away from the monster that was catching up with him, he recalled what he knew about the iron lizard. This monster was known as a swordsman killer due to the fact that its armor is so durable, and using any physical attack or stone spear would probably have no effect on it at all on him, and the evil monster will remain intact. So now it's time to use his staff. Slightly exposing his small staff from under Suzumiya Kazda's shield, he began to use magic spells. At the moment, the current maximum level of magic power he could channel to amplify magic was only 10 points per second. Despite Kazda's high speed, the monster could grab him anew at any moment and prevent him from striking. Trying not to stop, Suzumiya Kazda decided to turn his gaze to the monster that was overtaking him and assess the situation he had to fight in. The young man thought about the need to channel his magic power for 1 minute, but at this fast pace, a minute could seem like an eternity. With a proper assessment of the situation, Suzumiya Kazda was able to turn around to face his opponent and gather full concentration. The guy let out a huge fireball directly into the iron lizard's face. Now his firepower would strike this monster and it would stop its terrifying run. The fire completely engulfed the iron lizard's face. The animal was already screaming, either from pain or from the rage caused by the unexpected blow. The tongues of flame seemed to have fused with the skin of the iron lizard, and now it looked even more terrifying than before. The iron scales completely absorbed the fire that Suzumiya Kazda directed at it. Seeing this, the young man realized that the opponent remained intact. His fire magic did not cause any damage to that ravenous beast. Suzumiya Kazda didn't understand how the lizard could survive such a huge scalding flame. The monster, on the other hand, did not hesitate, and decided to attack more vigorously. The iron lizard turned its head in such a way that it almost hit Kazda, but the high level of concentration helped the young man to bounce back in time and maintain his vitality level. But Suzumiya Kazda had forgotten that the iron lizard had a long tail, a blow that could take a man's life. A single touch of that tail could cause Suzumiya Kazda irreparable damage, and it was the tail that had the crushing power. The iron lizard turned its back to its opponent and raised its heavy, long tail. It swung around to gather strength for the strike. In just a split second, Suzumiya Kazda managed to deflect the swing of the iron lizard's tail. The metallic tail swept right over Suzumiya Kazda at a few centimeters in front of his face, barely missing him, though still the edge of the tail's scales managed to graze the guy's knee. Suzumiya Kazda felt immense pain as he fell from the impact of the metal tail. He tried not to scream the crazy feelings he was feeling right now. And the iron lizard kept on waving its tail and throwing more and more blows. The vicious predator wanted to kill this man, but he kept running away from him. Until the iron lizard got to the man, all the trees around it were fallen. She cut them down by waving her tail. One by one, the trees fell to the ground, and the speed of the tail swipes was as fast as the speed of this lizard. Therefore, when the tree trunk was cut, the only thing that could be seen was the whistling sound of the tail flying. And then the thud of the huge tree hitting the ground. All the grass underneath the lizard was trampled. While the iron lizard moved and demolished everything in its path, Suzumiya Kazda studied all of its movements and speed of striking. He was calculating where and when the lizard would strike with its tail. He was also trying to figure out how much force it would use. And every time the iron lizard was close to killing a human, Suzumiya Kazda skillfully turned away from its attack. Even though the lizard's tail only lightly grazed the man's bone with that fleeting movement, the force of the impact was enough to cause a fracture. Despite the broken leg, Suzumiya Kazda looked for the positives in everything. He had already learned healing magic. All that was left to do now was to wait for his bone to fuse. For now, the healing magic continued its work on restoring his bones. Suzumiya Kazda had to keep his composure and stay alert. Because of the searing pain from his broken bone, he could faint. And if that happened, it would be the end. That lizard would hit the man with one blow and he would die instantly, probably without even knowing the moment it happened. But Suzumiya Kazda was determined not to let that monster enter the city. After all, there were so many beautiful people that Suzumiya Kazda was already attached to. He remembered all the people who had deeply touched his heart. It was the cute girl Sally who helped him all the time, Dovergan, the owner of the gun store, who was kind and constantly trained him, all the cute girls from the cafe where he had breakfast. Their pointy ears and large breasts beckoned to him. The owner of the tannery shop who honored his request and helped him purchase a staff. Era, the mage girl, who had made him the perfect staff despite her principled and untrustworthy nature. All of these people he met along the way were dear to the boy. Suzumiya Kazda regretted that he had talked and spent so little time with them. No, there was no way he was going to let an iron lizard enter this city. Standing right in front of the huge monster, Suzumiya Kazda looked firmly into the iron lizard's eyes. The guy gritted his teeth. He promised that he would definitely kill the iron lizard and not let this monster destroy what had become the young man's hometown. At this time, the huge metal lizard opened its mouth. The terrifying monster was preparing for a decisive attack on the human. Its entire appearance was a solid threat to the young man's life. Since Suzumiya Kazda didn't have any magic with a stabbing effect, so he tried to think of something he could use to defeat this monster. The guy only had one attempt. This time, there would be only one winner. Suzumiya Kazda had no choice but to create a new magic using earth magic as an example, and when Suzumiya Kazda threw himself into the battle, the guy roughly understood what effect he wanted to achieve with the new enhancement. This was something new even for him. He had never used this type of magic before. Suzumiya Kazda stopped right in front of the iron lizard. He stretched out a shield in front of him with his magic wand underneath. It was hidden to free his friend's hand for his sword. Suzumiya Kazda stood completely focused. He was concentrating on the magic that was about to take place. But to his deep disappointment, the magic did not happen. Since Suzumiya Kazda didn't see any effect, he realized that the magic hadn't activated. The young man looked carefully at his staff, which was hiding behind a shield, and began to wonder if there was some special condition for the realization of his unusual imagination. After all, at the moment, it was the only thing that could save him from a stupid and cruel death. While Suzumiya Kazda was thinking about how to create the effect of magic, his opponent, the metal lizard, was delivering more and more tail strikes. Suzumiya Kazda had to stop his immobilized position and start deflecting the blows, because just a little more, and the tail with the last blow would not be on the ground but on the guy. As he turned away from another strike from Suzumiya, Kazda realized that his business was not good. There was no way he could defeat this monster with his current magic. Fear enveloped the young man more and more and stiffened his movements, affecting every cell of his body. The metal lizard once again began to turn on its axis. She wanted to look at her opponent face to face. Around the place where the opponents were lying cut down by the tail of the iron lizard were trees and the cold bodies of animals that the lizard had also destroyed. At this moment, when the monster made another battle cry in the head of Suzumiya, Kazda came up with a crazy idea. The guy opened his eyes wide, remembering what could save him now. There was still one more of the skills he had never used. Suzumiya Kazda remembered that unlike sword fighting, magic could be accumulated to increase its power. It's like a time bomb. In his past real world, he once heard that about a projectile that tanks uses. To increase penetration, the projectiles that soldiers launch. It doesn't necessarily have to have a high explosive power. Rather, it has to be fast and use pressure to penetrate hard armor. In a way, the iron lizard was like a tank, and he would become that very projectile. Looking at the status window screen, Suzumiya Kazda realized that the only way to break through that hard armor on the iron lizard was to use the magic he received in his training. Suzumiya Kazda actively searched for the key to activate it. After all, right now it was the only way that looked reliable in his eyes and could work to make the man come out of the battle victorious. And that was pressure magic. Suzumiya Kazda already had this magic at the 3rd level, and it was not inferior to earth or water magic. Suzumiya Kazda turned away from the status window screen and began to put all his tools into his inventory. It's going to be a very gamble from now on. Suzumiya Kazda thought about the fact that he was going to put all of his magic, all 9,000 units of magic power he had left exactly into that crushing blow using pressure magic. But in order to put the full power into his new pressure magic, he needed to restore it, and that required about 15 minutes. So now there was nothing left but to run away from the monster that was already coming to attack. Suzumiya Kazda would now dodge the blows to conserve her energy. Since Suzumiya Kazda already knew all of his opponent's movements and behavior, he could easily dodge. He was anticipating the exact locations of his strikes. All the blows that the Iron Lizard's tail made did not cause any damage to the young man, since he could deflect at the right second due to his knowledge of the monster's behavior. He anticipated which side the blow would come from. Of course, it was difficult. After all, the huge tail of the metal lizard was a powerful tool. It pressed down like a huge hammer and wounded like a sharp sword. Thanks to its light and maneuverable shield, Suzumiya Kazda was able to deflect the blows while remaining unharmed. Kazda had the added advantage of being able to use his martial arts talent. This was also one of his skills. It allowed him to read his opponent's movements and reflect them in time without causing any damage to his own body. By actively using this skill, Suzumiya Kazda could calmly calculate in which direction the Iron Lizard would wag its tail to avoid being hit by its smashing strike. Even though the tail strike he could reflect, it was still very painful. Even if some millimeter on his body was butted by a part of the Iron Lizard's tail, it brought unbearable pain to Kazda. But because of the adrenaline that was in his blood now, and the high level of healing magic, he almost didn't feel any pain during the battle, only paying attention to the interfering irritation in various areas of his body. Since Suzumiya Kazda's movement speed was great, it was still not enough to run far away from the monster. While he was running around the Iron Lizard, a sound appeared meaning that 15 minutes of preparation had already passed. His magic had recovered, and he was fully prepared to strike. This is the moment that will decide the outcome of this battle. Suzumiya Kazda is running straight at the iron monster, and the lizard, jumping on its huge paws, is running straight at its opponent. It wants to devour him with a single bite. In those brief fractions of a second in which the two opponents were converging, Suzumiya Kazda was desperately thinking about where the weakest part of the Iron Lizard's armor was. After all, that was where the crushing blow needed to be delivered. If the location was wrong, then Suzumiya Kazda would die. After all, he wouldn't get a second chance. Making a final push from the ground to get higher, Suzumiya Kazda decided that the weakest part of the Iron Lizard's armor was the part where it was rarely hit, and that was the monster's back. Why the back? Because it was so high up and protected from all sides, an ordinary adventurer or animal would not be able to reach that secret place. The Iron Lizard saw the man jumped high from the ground, and so with a formidable scream opened its mouth, watching all of Suzumiya Kazda's movements. The Iron Lizard didn't want to lose either, so it was thinking that it was about to open its mouth wide and swallow this unfortunate person. But Suzumiya Kazda didn't plan on giving up. Therefore, with a loud cry that the monster was about to taste unprecedented power, began to descend from a height right onto the monster's back. The Iron Lizard at this moment also wanted to push off from the ground and jump high. Therefore, at this moment, pits were formed under its huge paws. The young man's face was clear and desperate. Suzumiya Kazda draped his arm higher to prepare the maximum comfortable pose for his crushing strike. This was his all-out attack. Pressure magic appeared and flowed out of Suzumiya Kazda's palm like a black hole. While Suzumiya Kazda was still in the air, he released all the energy inside him, all 9,000 levels of mana. The enormous force power fell from above the monster. It hit the weakest and most unprotected spot. The pressure magic struck the back of the metal monster, but because of the dust and air vibration, it was unclear whether Suzumiya Kazda was able to deliver a crushing blow, one that gave man in the city a chance of survival. In the brief moments when the veil receded in front of Kaz's face, he saw the monster's huge mouth screaming in unbearable pain. In his eyes and the monster's eyes, he read fear and pain. He had never experienced such feelings before. On the back of the metal lizard was a huge hole between the metal plates. These metal plates that used to be its shell had been destroyed, and now a huge hole had appeared there from the impact of Suzumiya Kazda's magic power. The young man was still continuing to release his magic. His face was so tense that veins protruded on his forehead. Suzumiya Kazda was stretching out his arms as much as he could to release the full potential of his magic and destroy this monster. The boy watched until the dust cleared to see where this was going. The young man's face was very tense, although he had already finished his strike, but he couldn't come back from the high pressure yet. He needed to go downstairs and calm down. When the dust and air vibrations settled, Suzumiya Kazda saw that the metal lizard had fallen under the ground. Or maybe it was a hole appeared on the monster's body through which the ground was visible. While the metal lizard was screaming in unbearable pain, Suzumiya Kazda began to land on the ground. From his appearance, one could tell how tired he was, but the guy was trying to keep his cool. After all, the course of the battle could be completely different from what he expected. In his hands from the inventory already appeared a sword, with which, if anything, he could defend himself. But the screams of the metal lizard soon subsided. The sounds subsided, and they were no longer screams of anger. They were tears of pain and tears of death of the iron lizard. The beast could no longer move. The only thing it could do was cry. Had Kazd really succeeded in making this strike? He stopped and stared intently at the remains of the iron lizard lying in front of him. The eyes of this iron lizard were slowly fading away. In them, the young man saw all the pain of this world. Yes, he had succeeded in defeating the metal lizard. A huge hole appeared in its body, lying motionless on the ground from the pressure magic, and its paws were no longer holding that heavy body, but lying along it. While Suzumiya Kazda was trying to catch his breath from the tremendous work done, notification sounds began to appear, alerting him to the upgrades of his various ability levels. And in front of him lay a body that had a huge hole in it, through which the guy could see what was going on the other side of the glade. The realization that he was able to defeat this monster single-handedly betrayed the young man's strength. He stood up, holding his weapon and constantly repeating the same thing. He did it. He won. After defeating the metal lizard, Suzumiya Kazda would return to the city. Just in case, he checked his surroundings with a self-made radar. But the radar was silent. It seems that the monsters that the iron lizard was controlling had retreated. Suzumiya Kazda was running, but not that fast anymore. He wanted to be more careful going back to the city so as not to cause more trouble that he had just saved everyone from. As Suzumiya Kazda scrutinized the radar readings, he hoped that Sally and everyone else dear to him were safe. He was completely oblivious to what was going on around him, just staring at his radar screen. Suddenly he heard his name spoken by a familiar voice. Ahead of him ran a nervous Sally. Behind her were the rest of the town, but she was running the fastest. Her eyes were swollen with tears, but she was so happy to see the young man alive. Suzumiya Kazda started to just walk, approaching the girl who wanted to be near him faster and ran towards him. When the tired girl stopped in front of the guy, he asked why she thought he was dead. The girl said that he himself rushed forward, and because of that, she allowed such thoughts. The monsters that were approaching the city had already disappeared, and she still didn't see him anywhere. The girl stood with her head bowed and tried to catch her breath from her fast run. Sally lifted her head, her face red either from running or from embarrassment. She hardly looked at Kazid, but her big shiny eyes were full of tears. The girl wondered where the young man was. She was very much worried about him. Sally sweetly clasping her hand to her breast as she said all these words. It seemed like she was about to burst into tears. Suzumiya Kazda carefully watched the girl's behavior and movement. He had no idea that she had become so emotional just because of a single adventurer. The only thing the guy uttered was that he felt pity. Pity that he had made her feel such unpleasant emotions because of him. The girl's small palms clutched tightly at her breasts, he such tender words. But after all, she had told him to go to the front lines and defeat as many monsters as possible. The girl's legs were turned inward. She was worried standing in front of the young man. The girl was embarrassed. After all, she had asked him to join the others on the front line and fight off the monsters. Sally hadn't asked him to commit his rash actions. The young men were still facing each other, trying to explain themselves. All the girl's utterances and words made Kaz a little embarrassed. Sweat broke out on his face from the awkwardness of the situation. Now that she mentioned it and he thought hard, Suzumiya Kazda realized that this was exactly what the girl was saying. The tired Sally lowered her head and gazed and sighed heavily. She couldn't understand why this young man was constantly doing some rash actions. Of course, earlier all his actions were for the good, but now was not the situation in which it was necessary to make himself a hero. The girl realized that further conversations about his behavior were pointless, so she began to question him about what he did when the monsters retreated. Suzumiya Kazda replied that he was just checking the surroundings, because after he encountered the iron lizard, there could be other monsters nearby. The girl was very frightened when she heard about the iron lizard. How could he encounter it? It was so dangerous. Panic and terror flickered across the girl's face. Her face turned very pale and she began to tremble. Iron lizard. This was very bad. She needed to inform the mages immediately. But there were only 5 mages in the town. We need to request reinforcements. Seeing the way the girl was frightened after his words, Suzumiya Kazda tried to calm the girl down quickly. After all, she might not have to worry about all those monsters anymore. The guy had already defeated the iron lizard. The girl seemed to have lost her speech after hearing that. She couldn't believe that he could single-handedly defeat the iron lizard. Time had stopped around, not her. Not a single soul, and no leaf moved while she tried to realize everything the young man had told her. And Suzumiya Kazda was standing in front of the girl with an innocent face, saying that the monsters probably retreated just because he killed the iron lizard. His eyes were so calm, and there was a small smile on his face that was appealing and mesmerizing. Sally was still standing silently with her mouth slightly open in surprise. Her huge eyes rounded even more, and the tears only conveyed more brilliance. The girl looked meaningfully at the real person in front of her and didn't know what to say to him. After a while, Sally came to her senses. She remembered that Suzumiya Kazda was a sword mage. Now she exhaled calmly, because in this case, there was nothing surprising about his victory over the iron lizard. The girl, gesturing vigorously, began to explain to the guy that most of the time, to defeat an iron lizard, one would need a group of rank 3 or higher, and then they would use wind magic to lift the lizard into the sky and burn the insides with fire magic, bypassing the armor. The girl with her story gave a vivid picture of how it was happening, but after her explanations, the girl decided to find out how Suzumiya Kazda defeated the iron lizard. The girl, gesturing vigorously, began to explain to the guy that most of the time, to defeat an iron lizard, you need a group of rank 3 or higher, and then they would use wind magic to lift the lizard into the sky and burn the insides with fire magic, bypassing the armor. The girl with her story gave a vivid picture of how it happened, but after her explanation, the girl decided to find out how Suzumiya Kazda defeated the iron lizard. Suzumiya Kazda averted his gaze from the girl, for he had just taken his magic and pierced through the iron lizard armor. The girl's face immediately changed. From that moment on, the girl stopped believing in the guy's words. It couldn't be that he just pierced through the iron lizard's armor. Perhaps that iron lizard he fought was with weaker armor than what humans had previously encountered. In order to see if that was actually the case, the guy suggested that Sala take a look at the corpse of the iron lizard. The iron lizard was lying on his inventory. With a flick of his hand, Suzumiya Kazda opened his inventory and the iron lizard began to appear on the field. The girl was startled and took a step back. Sally stood amazed at what she saw. The iron lizard was so huge. What was the size of this Kazda's inventory then? Smiling embarrassedly, Suzumiya Kazda said that his inventory was slightly larger than the others. The girl stared mesmerized at the monster that appeared in front of her feet. It was definitely an iron lizard. A huge hole had to be in its back. The girl ran up to the corpse of the monster and decided to take a look for herself. Suzumiya Kazda stood and watched as this fragile girl ran towards such a huge dead monster. It was definitely an iron lizard. A huge hole had to be in its back. Sally seemed even more small and fragile against the huge corpse. The boy offered to help her. The girl seemed about to faint from the awkwardness of the situation. The girl was in the arms of Kazd, whom she liked. The girl's face turned even redder, and her eyes began to sparkle. The girl didn't know what to say to the guy, but it was useless to resist. With the girl in his arms, Suzumiya Kazda landed directly on the huge pieces of armor and the iron lizard. The guy's cloak slowly descended as he walked on the back of the huge monster. It was unbelievable. The girl leaned her head closer to Kazd's chest and held onto his cloak tightly with her hands. The girl tried not to look at him, her face red with embarrassment. When they reached the necessary place, Suzumiya Kazda looked at the girl and said that she could look at the hole, but the girl, without looking at Kazda, replied that he needed to let her go on her feet first. Suzumiya Kazda apologized for not thinking of it right away and gently lowered the girl to her feet. The girl only opened her eyes when she felt a solid surface under her feet. The girl stared intently at what was unfolding in front of her. She had never seen such unusual things before in her life. The girl thought it was a very striking sight, and after all, the girl had never heard of magic that was capable of creating a hole of this size, especially in the body of an iron lizard. Apparently, this Kazd must have a magic that was fundamentally different from the magic of this town. The girl obediently folded her hands on her skirt and thanked the guy once again for destroying the iron lizard. The girl would definitely report it to the head branch. Before the girl could finish her sentence, Suzumiya Kazda interrupted her. The guy understood everything perfectly, and decided to say goodbye to her, agreeing to see her later. The girl looked at Kaede in surprise and asked what he was talking about. After all, the guy should go with her. The girl did not blink and looked at the guy with her huge eyes and did not understand why he so abruptly wanted to leave her. But after all, Suzumiya Kaede never stayed by the girl's side. After completing the task, and he never saw any branch head of this town, so he didn't understand why the girl was looking at him so surprised and why he should go with her. But there was no way out. So in the evening, they headed to the township, to the branch building. Upon entering the building, the girl led the guy into a room, the entrance to which was no smaller than the entrance to the building itself with beautiful golden knobs. The place looked very expensive. When Suzumiya Kaede entered the room and approached the table of the clan's guild head, the guy was completely not expecting what happened next, and the clan head started pounding on the table with his fists and banging his head on the surface of the table. The man was screaming that he was the one to blame for the situation that had happened. Sally stood near the door with her head slightly bowed and listened and watched carefully to what was happening. But Suzumiya Kaede tried to somehow calm down the guild leader, but he didn't know what to say to him. At the table, the guy clarified whether the man who was in front of him was the head of the branch of this city. But the guy didn't quite understand the situation and asked the man to raise his head from the table. The man who sat in front of him and was introduced to him as the head of the guild. The man had known for some time now that monsters were acting very suspicious. This hair color and the man whose face was covered with a beard and mustache said this was a sign that a mighty monster was about to appear. But he didn't do anything about it, so he takes full responsibility for this incident. If this Kaede wasn't here, many people would have died. As the representative of this guild, he thanks the young man for his help. With huge eyes, Suzumiya Kaede sat looking at the guild head. Naturally, without a plan, the Iron Lizard was really hard to defeat, but he was only in this room now because of his strength and ingenuity. While Suzumiya Kaede thought about the fact that the guild probably didn't have a big budget to solve this problem. Out loud, he was saying something completely different. The guy was thinking about the fact that there was nothing that could be done here. After all, the guild leader wasn't sure if a mighty monster would appear. Leaning his hands on the table, the man was very embarrassed in front of this young man. The guy was not only strong, but also an understanding person. The branch head decided that after something like this, he might as well ask this Kaede for a favor. The man got fully to his feet, pushing his chair away from him towards the huge window. It was necessary to look dignified. As the head of the branch was very frightened, from fear and nerves, sweat broke out on the formidable man's face. The man raised his trembling hands to his chest and asked to keep this Iron Lizard incident a secret. The man didn't want to cause confusion in the city at all. But Suzumiya Kaede didn't understand at all what the matter was about, what kind of confusion the man didn't want to cause, and why the Iron Lizard had to be a huge secret to everyone in the town and the other guild branches. This seemed very strange. The branch head covered his eyes. Sooner or later, the guild would announce it publicly, but for now, the rumors about the appearance of the Iron Lizard were enough to raise a fuss in the town. Suzumiya Kaede recalled how she reacted from her comrade's words about the Iron Lizard. It wasn't normal for her, and if the branch head announces that the Iron Lizard was defeated by an adventurer, no one would believe the branch. On the contrary, it would only confuse the people more. The man sat back down at his seat and folded his arms. Of course, it was only his request. The man suggested that Suzumiya Kaede keep this victory announcement for himself. If Suzumiya Kaede wanted it, but the young man was nice enough, and he refused. The guy didn't need the announcement of defeating the Iron Lizard at all. But there were thoughts swirling around in Kaze's mind that it would be a problem if he couldn't keep from telling anyone. So the guy decided to tell the head of the branch directly that he would like to tell the owner of the armory all about it. The guy wants to make an Iron Lizard into a weapon for himself. The branch head was surprised that this young man knows the owner of the gun shop. In any case, if he told him, it wouldn't be a problem because the gun shop owner can keep secrets and he rarely talks to people anyway. The branch master also warned Kaze that there was no equipment in their city that could process the Iron Lizard to create weapons, so he would have to look for it in other cities. Not even 5 minutes later, after apologizing and repenting, the branch head turned into a strict and cruel man. When it came to other people's requests, the man no longer acted like a trembling boy. Suzumiya Kaede had never heard of other cities, so such a suggestion surprised and confused him. The lad asked what other cities the masters were talking about. The head of the council explained to the boy what he would need to do. Suzumiya Kaede thought about the fact that he would need to visit the Forge City, and the guy would have to leave this place. But since the monsters that dwell in that small town are of low status, the guy will definitely go where the branch head pointed out. Suzumiya Kaede started packing for the trip. The guy had learned that when traveling through this world, it was best to travel at night and sleep at noon. Since the guy still had time before leaving, he decided to say goodbye to everyone who had helped him. It was the owner of the workshop where he bought his armor, and the girl master, despite her reluctance to make them agreed. And also Era, the mage girl who had customized a staff for him, despite all her hysterical laughter at his idea of a short staff. They were the maid girls from the cafe he had breakfast at. They were cutely embarrassed when Suzumiya Kazda walked in to say goodbye to them. Their cheeks flushed slightly, and their sharp ears quivered cutely. Of course, the guy had stopped by to see his dear gun shop owner, who seemed to already know that Suzumiya Kazda was going on a trip, and the man was inordinately happy for him. This was a true event. After all, the elderly armorer knew from the moment they met that this guy had many wonderful discoveries ahead of him. The lad gathered all his belongings and the positivity of all the people he knew. It looked like it was time to hit the road. The road ahead was going to be long and interesting. The last place Suzumiya Kazda decided to stop by was the branch office of the guild branch, where the very first good soul of this city, Sally, worked. Suzumiya Kazda smiled and said that he had brought some guests that he had collected at the very beginning of his arrival in this town. It was the Zunana herb that started the young man's physical and spiritual growth. With a huge smile on his face, the boy held out the herb to the girl. The girl's eyes widened at the surprise of Suzumi Kazda's appearance. She didn't expect to see the guy here, much less have him stop by to say goodbye. So she just sat there and looked at the young man with her huge, glittering eyes, waiting for Kaz's further words. Something inside the girl informed her that the words he was about to say might upset her, or even make the girl very sad. Sally sat at the front desk, asking about what could have happened. Maybe something happened to the head of the branch. Suzumiya Kazda was looking at the girl and held the grass in his hands and did not take his eyes off her. The guy was reassuring with his smile. After all, nothing special had happened, except that Suzumiya Kazda had decided to leave this city. It was his conscious decision that was to be announced to everyone. So he went in to say goodbye to this nice girl who had been kind to him from the beginning. While people walked around the young men, each going about their business, it was as if time around the young people had stopped. Suzumiya Kazda revealed that he would go to Herrera to make a new weapon. After all, an adventurer like this guy couldn't stay still. Suzumiya Kazda's words left the girl confused. She couldn't believe what she heard, so she just stared with her mouth wide open at the man she liked who wanted to leave her and go to other cities. Adventurers traveled often enough. It was normal for the young man as well, but for the girl it seemed something difficult. The girl didn't think that this young man would leave her so soon. Her heart snapped in her chest. Suzumiya Kazda asked not to worry, this sweet girl who was ready to cry right in front of him. After all, Suzumiya Kazda had already destroyed so many green wolves, and was also in a battle with an iron lizard. The young man had defeated all the monsters and beasts that could threaten this small town and her. The girl raised her head and looked at the guy with her clear eyes. After all, he was absolutely right. The town should definitely be safe now, even while he wasn't here, and Sally would await his return here. Sally felt the full range of emotions after the young man's words. Even though she was very sad, she smiled because he was right. Suzumiya Kazda had already done a lot for her and for the town. The girl decided not to show her emotion, so she quickly cleaned herself up and got up from the front desk. She didn't say anything to him in response to what he told her about his departure. She turned the conversation to work and asked if he would like to sell the herb. If so, he would need to wait for her to bring the box. The guy seemed to realize why the girl was acting this way. She's trying to deal with the emotions that were struggling inside the little heart. Suzumiya Kazda recalled that when he came to this world, he was very lucky to meet such a kind person like Sally. After all, she was the one who helped him get to the city, find a job and a place to live, and climb so high up the career ladder. The boy held out a bundle of Zunana grass to the girl. It was this herb that revealed the history of his development in this branch of the guild. The man wished that this girl would be his employer again. Holding out the green sprig, Suzumiya Kazda thanked the girl for all her help. The girl, who had not had time to move away from the reception desk, turned around and looked at Suzumiya Kazda with the deepest tenderness. The guy was holding the green symbol of his beginning, telling Sally that he would like to meet somewhere again. The girl didn't expect to hear such words from him, so she just stood pensively. It seemed to Sally that she would never have heard such words from him. Why exactly now, at the parting, Suzumiya Kazda would say them? The girl sighed bitterly. She absolutely did not want to let him go. The petals of the Zunan grass were like small hearts, which symbolized the young people's feelings for each other. It was this herb that made Sally feel a different range of emotions for this young man. It was this herb that became the foundation of Suzumiya Kazda's development in her magical skills. Their only touch, in the entire time they had known each other, was the touch of their slender fingers against each other while passing this herb. Yes, the girl had agreed to meet him. After all, she had long had tender feelings for him and a desire to meet in private. The girl clutched the Zunun grass stem to her chest. Sally was happy to receive even such a symbolic gift. Yes, come on, the girl repeated it. She agreed to meet Suzumiya Kazda somewhere. Smiling at the unexpectedness of this offer, she felt the happiest in the world. The guy stood across from the girl and looked at her. Suzumiya Kazda tried to memorize her facial expression, her smile, the sparkle of her eyes, and the movement of her hair. After all, there was no telling how long it would be before they could see each other again and fulfill what they both wanted very much. And so the boy set off on his journey. Suzumiya Kazda's journey was far away, over mountains and rivers, to a strange city of blacksmiths called Herrera. The boy walked alone, but his chest was warmed by the warmth of his feelings.